I loved the game of football so much. I remember when I was younger, I was like, I don't know what the big fuss is about. I'd play this game for the rest of my life for free. Part of the reason I got so far is because I loved it so much. And when it became a business and the money was involved and the having to prove myself constantly and the performance anxiety and then the physical pain and the brutality of the sport and the having to stand up for myself and telling, shifting and having to like earn it in all these different ways. And it didn't become about the game anymore. It became about all the business involved in the game. And so part of the grieving process that I needed to go through was, when I decided to walk away, I was walking away from the business of the NFL that I believe stripped away and took away the love and the innocence I had for football.
Dude, Joe Hawley, we are in to another episode of Traveling to Consciousness, man. Welcome on the show. Super grateful you're here and just excited, man. This is going to be a dope conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. I love exploring the mystery and the unanswerable questions and some esoteric concepts. And it's just such a beautiful experience of reality to be able to explore and question and, have conversations with people about, all the things.
And even in the way you said that, it kind of feels like it's almost, hopefully this doesn't minimize it, but it honestly feels like an art in a sense of like, okay, if I hold true this one thing, like, and something new kind of comes into my reality, like, does that agree with it? Does that differ? Do I need to update my reality? Do I need to change this? And it's almost kind of like a painter kind of painting like a picture of like, okay, this one thing isn't the right shape. Like, let me see if I can change that a little or change this spot over here and kind of warp it to look a little bit more beautiful.
Yeah, you have to be open for new information. And I think curiosity is one of the most important tools any of us can really embody. And it's fascinating. And you look at the culture we grew up in and, the religion, most religions, the biggest enemy to at least the Christian based faith that I grew up in was the question why. And it was just like people at church, my parents, they didn't know how to answer or fulfill or satisfy my curiosities. And so they stifled it because to think for yourself is not really honored. And so to have a curious, open mind, I think is one of the most powerful things. And not attaching to a belief structure so rigidly, because that's when you start creating this us versus them. And if I have a belief and I'm attached to it, then if your belief is different than mine and your belief is, if there's potential that your belief is right, then that makes me wrong. And when it's tied up, when belief structures, especially around religion and a religion like Christianity is, really around the fear of death and what happens when I die and where am I going to spend eternity. And so if I'm attached to this idea of like, I know what I'm going to do when I die because of what I believe, if you believe different and there's a potential of that, then that makes me wrong. Then what happens when I die? And so I get attached to it, which creates a lot of other out there different from me, which creates a lot of conflict instead of being open, curious. And, on this journey I've been on, I when I first walked away from the NFL, it was like deep seeking. I wanted to know the answer and I was very curious. And I explored all these different avenues and we can get into all that. And I got to a point where I realized, oh, it's a mystery. Like you have to accept the fact that you don't know, because the knowing is found in in a feeling. Like the intellect and the mind tries to figure it out so it can have certainty. But my knowing that I've found is in a knowing in my heart. It's a knowing in this trust and faith. And that's, where real faith comes in. And we can speak to that because I've been contemplating that quite a bit as well, as like, what is faith, blind faith, earned faith, and the experience of life,
And it's certainly weird too when you start realizing that more truth comes from your heart than in your brain. Because like the model, you're like, okay, all the knowledge is stored in the brain. But then even through like different stories that I've heard, or even different, like there's a story I've talked about on here before where, this girl had a heart transplant, and whenever she got that heart transplant, she started having all these crazy nightmares. But I guess it wasn't all these different ones, but it was like the same nightmare over and over again. And what it led me to realize, or the way the story plays out, I suppose, is that the dream she was having was of this guy kind of coming in and stabbing her. And she kept waking up being terrified. She went to like a psychiatrist. She went to get all this different mental help, and people couldn't figure out what the cause of it was. Well, they started retracing kind of when it started, and it was whenever she got that heart transplant. Come to find out, the girl who she got the heart transplant from was actually stabbed to death. And the person who committed the murder was never found. And she like then started working with the FBI, told the person who was like in her dreams and like all this different stuff. And it led actually to a conviction of a guy, and then the prosecution of him who actually carried out this murder on that chick. And so,
Wow.
yeah, dude. And it's crazy too, because I've seen these like little stories. For some reason, that's the one that's like burned into my mind. But I've seen many different stories that have played this out where our bodies, like memory isn't only stored in the brain, it's stored throughout our body. And even from a computer engineering perspective, because that's where my background is. And we'll touch on that a bit more as we talk about climbing mountains. But that's a big thing that they figured out with like robots and like robot vision, is like a robot even has this, like it can talk, right? Like, ChatGPT, like that can talk with us in a language model, but it isn't actually able to engage with the environment if it doesn't have a physical body. So it's like this crazy conundrum of like, okay, well, where's memory stored? Where's information stored? Are we actually using our brains to think, or are we not using our entire body to think?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm excited to jam out about kind of how you see and view the world with all this rapid advancement of AI and technology, and like what's actually going to happen over the coming, not even coming decades anymore. It's like coming months and year or
You
two.
never
It's
know,
like so
dude.
much change.
Any second.
But yeah, I mean, that's one thing I'm learning a lot about is the psychosomatic connection and the process of healing and how much trauma is stored in the body. And it seems like the emotional body is what connects the physical body, the mental body, the spiritual body. And in a culture where, especially as men, we're not really taught how to properly feel. Not only we're not taught, and there's no safety created for us to actually go into emotions. We're shamed and judged for it from a very young age. When I have a 2-year-old son, and the way he feels his emotions is just so like intense and full on, and he just doesn't hold back. Like if he feels
There's
something,
like
like
no
you can feel
interrupt.
the energy. Yeah, and when we suppress those emotions, that's what creates a lot of dis-ease in our bodies. And talking about like the mental health crisis, and like if you're talking about mental health, and I think it's there's a level of that that's really beautiful, like destigmatizing mental health and the conversation, and people be able to talk about it. But we're still not getting to the root of like, why is there such a mental health crisis? And you can't isolate mental health to the mind. It's when you look at it, it's like, well, what are you fueling your body? Like, what's your physical health? That affects it. What's your emotional health? What kind of unprocessed emotional trauma do you have in your body that you haven't really felt? Because that gets stored in what's called the soma, the somatic experiencing of the physical organism. And yeah, I think I've had a lot of really powerful like psychosomatic healings, and being able to process a lot of that energy through my body. And in that process, it's really fascinating how like literally stories and narratives and thought loops and resentment and anger and all these things that are stored that create these stories in my mind and projections of reality. When I'm able to just feel the emotions in a safe space and like let that go, like I can literally see them unwinding and letting go and like flying away. And it's like, oh, there's a deeper level of freedom and presence because I've been able to just feel this. And I think, if I could look out in the world and say like, what's one of the biggest issues we face is just this collective, both individual, which leads to a collective amount of just unprocessed grief. And we don't know how to grieve. We don't never been taught how to grieve. We don't feel safe to grieve. Grief is a very scary emotion.
And
Um,
maybe
and I
that's a
think the more
good,
we can really connect with that.
yeah, maybe that's a good place we can kind of tie in your story a little bit too, because First of all, I want to give a shout out to Kyle Kingsbury. Your podcast on his, I think it was episode 299. I was just listening to it this morning. And I think if anyone's super interested in Joe Hawley's story, like go listen to that podcast, because he kind of just steps through it piece by piece. And it's a wild story, Joe. It's a one of a kind for sure. And I think, to get back to this grieving aspect, right? I noticed it, I think in your or in that podcast, whenever you kind of started realizing and processing, like it might have been just before you were about to leave the NFL, because you kind of saw the writing on the wall, but there was a point in that story where you started grieving, and it seemed like, I don't, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seemed to me that your whole world, and not even your world, but people who were in your world, were really identifying you and your life around being an NFL player. Like that was who you were. Football was you. It was your life. It was the mountain that you had climbed to the top, right? You were at the top of the NFL mountain. And to realize, like, okay, at some point I'm going to have to go down this mountain and climb up a new one. I'm going to have to, in essence, start over my maybe professional career, or even the career that I am projecting out to the world. So, I mean, I guess, walk me through that a little, right? Like the grieving aspect, realizing that, this was your identity, and I guess even did grieving help you in dissolving that identity that you had identified with, and even the people around you?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, obviously it was so much deeper than anything I could have ever imagined. And I think that's one of the challenges, and I'm super grateful for it, because at the age of 29, I got to confront things that most people don't really have an opportunity to look at until they're, facing retirement at like 65. So the fact that I was accomplished like my childhood dream, was making millions of dollars, had basically enough money to buy anything I ever dreamed of as a kid, had the beautiful partner I was about to marry, like everything was looking like it was, this is it. And there was still something missing. And I'm really grateful that I was able to confront that and say, okay, well, what else is out there? Like it felt like this self-created prison that I was trapped in. It was like something that, I imagined this big mansion that I was building for myself, of like this dream. And I got to a point where it was like super, like I made it. But then it was like all of a sudden there was, bars on the windows. And like I didn't know what it was like on the outside of this house, and like, yeah, there's a nice sofa, a big TV, but what else is out there in life? And I felt like kind of suffocated by it. And, I'm someone that, had my head on right, and was in, really like prepared, I guess you could say, for this thing, but it's something you can't really prepare for. And, I was really surprised, as someone that always said, because they like, there's people that want to support athletes, right? And like the teams are like, NFL stands for not for long. Make sure you have a backup plan. Like you can't play forever. And so these things are always kind of like preached at you. But the fascinating like dichotomy of it, or the juxtaposition, is like if you start preparing, it's gonna lead you to being done, because you have to be so singularly focused in such a hyper competitive environment that if you're thinking about a backup plan, then you might as well walk away, because you're done. And that's kind of what happened to me. It was like it was like I lost my starting job for the 5th time in my 8th year, and I was on the sidelines. And every other time it had happened, I had this like fire and passion of like, I need to prove myself that I belong out there with the best, and I want to compete, and it's what I love to do. And this year I was like, wow, I'm actually happy I'm not playing. And I was like, oh wow, like that was when I knew this was going to be my last year playing. And I started stripping away these stories, and I told my fiance at the time, like, hey, this is going to be my last year playing. And she was super unsupportive of that decision. And that's when I started realizing, and I told my parents. My dad's like, well, what are you going to do for money? Like, what are you talking about? You're going to walk away? Like, you worked your entire life for this? Like, they couldn't compute for them. And I realized, okay, this is very fascinating. I'm on this path of desiring to know the deeper truths of who I am and what life's about and why am I here, because there's something that's left unsatisfied within me, and I'm ready to go explore those deeper questions. And I was just seeing how it's not just me and my attachments to this identity. It's everybody that is in my life that loved me and viewed me as this athlete. And there was, even unconsciously, like I don't fault them for this, but there's something in it for them. because they got something out of it. And so there's just like this, it's not just me in isolation, it's this whole energy of what I was able to accomplish in such a pinnacle, like idolized position in our society, and to actively participate in letting that go consciously and participating in that. Like there's not a lot of guys that really go through that, and I'm really grateful I got a chance to really be present with my final year and strip it all away. And then it was like played my last game, and the finality of it was like, it was so intense. It was something I just, no matter how hard if I tried to prepare for it, it was like, holy cow. And it was like a week after my final game, I was sitting in my apartment, and it just, I can feel it right now. It's just like this intense grief that it felt like there was a void in my heart, and I had actively ripped my own heart out. And it was, I broke off my engagement. I felt estranged from my parents, and now realizing I'm never going to be able to play this game that I love so much. And the amount of just emotion and grief felt so intense and far reaching, and the depth of it, like I didn't even know how to access it. And intuitively it was like, I need to go on a journey. Like I just need to get moving. I need to move this energy somehow. And I felt very isolated and alone, and ended up stripping everything away. I even gave away all my like physical possessions to charity, which was really
Yeah, I
cool,
think
because it was like this, even that was physical weight on me.
You watched like a movie on minimalism or something?
Yeah, it was when minimalism was first kind of like introduced through the Netflix documentary called The Minimalists. They now have like a huge podcast, and they've done a couple different documentaries. They're actually really popular. And yeah, it was, it was like leading up to that decision. It wasn't just like, oh, I had something and I want to walk away from the game. It was this slow awakening, Like I read my first book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari in 2014. And it was like the first, like, it was like a fable about this trial lawyer that had reached the pinnacle, but he had a heart attack. And he basically, the doctors told him, like, you have to let go of your law practice or you're going to kill yourself. And it's cool to look back on like a lot of the parallels in my life, like that go back to that book. I read books like Into the Wild, and like these like, wow, what is it like out there? Like, it was this desire to experience freedom, and it was just,
Or even
it's
like,
interesting. I think a lot of people like go ahead.
what does freedom even mean? Like the
Yeah.
level of that.
I keep accessing like deeper and deeper layers of what it is, and it's like, how deep does the onion go? Because there's so much tied into the programming and the indoctrination. And I'm getting to deeper layers now, and we can dive more into this. But even like the spiritual path, and like realizing like what is true abundance, what is true freedom, like these questions. And I bought a 72 acre piece of property about a year ago, 90 minutes outside Austin, and really starting to confront like what is actual spirituality, like what is sovereignty, what is freedom. And what I'm starting to really connect with, because I did this cleanse just recently as well, and we could dive into that, where I like really questioned and like was basically clearing out my body. It was a gut reset, and there was like a parasite cleanse involved. And realizing and talking to my friend that was kind of helping support me through this process, was how much toxins and poison there is in not only our environment but our food system, and how disconnected all of us are from where our food comes from. And
For
even
sure.
organic food is like the soil is not as nutrient dense as it used to be. And so even this like healthy, good looking organic fruits and vegetables doesn't have the nutrient dense like energy and frequency that our body really needs. And I mean that alone, and then like obviously all the processed foods and stuff, is like our body doesn't process that as nutrients. It's like poison, really. And so I'm accessing, like, I eat really healthy, and then I'm going through this detox. I'm like, holy cow, like, and when I felt so like connected and clean, and my energy levels were like super consistent. And me and my partner are about to move out to our land, and she's getting into like permaculture and growing our own food. And what does that look like? And going through this detox at the same time was like really connecting me with what would it feel like to be in right relation with my food. and grow my own food and love and nurture and care for the plants that are actually feeding me and my family and my community. And there's a deeper spiritual component to that, and the frequency. And I don't know what that's like, but I can only imagine the expansion of freedom and sovereignty and spiritual connection when, I mean, there's so many different layers to it, but even like the fear of, we talked about earlier, like what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And that conversation comes up a lot, especially in, in kind of the spiritual communities, or people that are like really questioning the paradigm and like, where do we head, and what do we do? And there's a potential of real catastrophic failure of systems, and the potential chaos that could ensue from that. And so it creates this like underlying fear of like, what do I do if I'm reliant so much on the system? And so I think there's this, like, it all points back to food. It's really, really fascinating. Like, how do we cultivate and grow our own food? And that, knowing that I have food that can fuel my family, like what else do you really need? That's when you can really start breaking down and like distancing yourself from the collective paradigm of what society tells us is reality, and be able to actually start building a new system. What that looks like, I don't know, but I know there's a lot of people, like Kyle Kingsbury is doing really great things out at the farm in Lockhart, and I'm so grateful for him because I'm learning so much, and I have a lot to learn, and I have no idea what I'm doing. But it's like we started by planting our garden. We have a garden, we're just planting food, putting it in the ground, and seeing what happens. And there's something really fascinating about connecting with food. Like, nature is so abundant. Like we have this avocado seed from an avocado that we got at the store. And like, you can put these little screws in it and let it sit like 3/4 in water. And over like a course of like 4 to 6 weeks, it cracks open and a little seedling comes out. And then you can take that and plant it in the ground. And that one seed is going to grow an avocado tree that will have hundreds of avocados. So it's, talk about the exponential like abundance of nature, like one seed to 100 to 100,000. Like it's like that. It's insane.
Yeah, and what you're touching on there is something I've always found so fascinating, right? Where, like, let's even take that idea and kind of transition it into our physical world, if you will, where it feels like, at least at a mass level, there's that paradigm of scarcity, if you will, where it's like, for instance, if I had a scarcity mentality throughout this podcast, I would have never mentioned Kyle Kingsbury's podcast, because it's like, if I mention that podcast and then my listeners go and listen to him, then they're no longer going to listen to me. You know what I mean? Like, that fear dynamic comes up. But even as you're kind of laying out right there, I mean, how many avocados are there sitting in grocery stores all across the world? And yet we could take 30 seconds to kind of just plant one. Of course, I know some people were probably living in situations that it's not feasible from an environment point of view, but it's like, how have you found a way, or like a way to cultivate or realize that, we're a part of nature? Like, we all have that intrinsic ability to be the seed that kind of grows into the plant that can feed all, or even find ways to create and plant seeds so that more people are able to prosper because of it.
Yeah. Wow. It's a big question. I think it's like Charles Eisenstein says, right? We're moving from this story of separation into this story of interbeing. And I mean, the whole paradigm that we are separate from nature is like, it's really quite fascinating. And these lower frequency energies of like scarcity and fear and worry and shame, and like all of that is needed to create the very structures that our economic system and kind of our financial systems, our socials, like all built on this idea of lack. Because and it's artificially created. And Charles Eisenstein has a really good book called Sacred Economics, which is a little bit dense and academic in parts and a little bit over my head, to be honest. But it's really, really powerful. Some of the concepts that I had never heard before, and like how debt works, and how artificial scarcity creates, this environment that we live in, and it creates, by definition, an unsustainable future, because there's always more to be had, and we never feel like we have enough, and it creates
What's the name of this
greed
book?
dynamics.
I might need to look this up.
Sacred Economics.
Sacred Economics.
Yeah, anything by Charles Eisenstein is really, really good.
I don't think I've ever heard his name before.
Oh, you got to check him out. Yeah. Him and Zach Bush are like the prophets of our time. Zach Bush is a medical doctor who's really connected to like the food system and how like what's really going on with like soil health and our gut health and how it's all connected. And Charles Eisenstein's like a philosopher and he's a economist and talks about macroeconomics and stuff that I can't even really regurgitate because it's like pretty
It's super
out there. And
dense. But
yeah,
it sounds like you pulled away something from it, right? In regards to this
100%.
artificial scarcity and how we're able to become the abundance, let's say, in the world. So what I didn't mean to cut you off. I wanted to make sure we nailed down that book title though.
Yeah, totally. And then what I've been, I'm really into like I love channeled texts. I don't know if you're into that at all.
The law, have you come
But
across the law of one?
yeah, like the Law of One. Paul Selig has some really good stuff, and I just ran into these. I forget the authors or the channel's name, but it's called the Joseph Communications, which is fascinating because my name's Joseph. But this was one of those like kind of recommended in Amazon or like Audible, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I clicked on it. It's cool how technology can create synchronicity, and like the universe can use technology to feed us like
It's all interconnected,
certain
man.
things.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah, it's really cool. But this has been a really powerful, like and I love an Audible because it's like these higher frequencies are channeling this information, and some stuff like resonates, some stuff doesn't. So like if you're someone's like, oh, channel text, like like what is that? It's like I've definitely listened to some stuff where like it doesn't resonate in my frequency. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to listen to that. But then some stuff just like it just speaks so deeply to my soul, and like we talked about before the show, like being really curious and open-minded and pulling like what resonates and what doesn't. And I think it's you know someone, I forget who said this, but it's like if you're really um attached to like is this true or not, you can get that can get you in a lot of trouble because then you're trying to figure out like what's true, what's not, and you're sifting through all this information, especially now with so much information being bombarded. The question to ask yourself is this useful? Can I use this information to make me a better person, to help me feel more grounded, help me understand a little bit more about what I'm moving through, and does it resonate? And I think that's a lot better question, a more useful question. And it's interesting to talk about this artificial scarcity and these denser frequencies like fear and scarcity and worry and doubt and shame and guilt and greed. And you talk about it from a spiritual perspective. I grew up in the Christian faith, and so there was always this story of the fall from the Garden of Eden, or the fall of grace, and the Adam and Eve eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and these symbols and metaphors and parables that you know attaching to them literally, I think, is missing the point. But they carry a lot of frequency. And these Joseph communication,
Mm.
there's a book actually called The Fall, and it talks about how us as we're angelic beings, right? We're energy beings. And if you really understand, even science says this now, like on the very, you know, smallest of scale, like we're just frequency and vibration. And so in reality, this whole experience is a hologram, it's a projection. And this actually doesn't actually exist. It's my interpretation in my brain. So the world is actually a psychic event that is happening from neural pathways connecting in a certain way from our visual cortex, creating the experience of physical reality. But in the depth of it, it's all vibration and frequency vibrating at different levels. And so when you think about kind of more of a spiritual, ethereal experience, that we would be able to create, if you think of us as like angelic beings, and we'd be able to create more fluidly and more in real time. And what happened in this fall, it talks about it as an experiment. And so it's a really good analogy. It talks about if the Godhead, the oneness of all creation, is one thing, if it wants to create separation to have an experience, you think of it as like a rope, right? Like a rope is one thing, but if you start unraveling the little strands within the rope, there's all these little individual experiences, but it's all part of the same rope.
Mm.
And so it talks about what God did is it kind of started separating into these more ethereal angelic beings, but there's a separate experiencer, a separate perspective of the same thing. And so as that kind of went further and further, um, this group of angelic beings was like, well, we think there's a way that we can create to bring more information and more growth and expansion to the Godhead through this new way of creating. And that basically, long story short, the way of creating is we're going to forget that we're God, and we're going to forget that we are an aspect of that creation, and which led to this deeper frequency of fear, scarcity, lack, like we're not connected to the all. And what that has created is this amnesia of who we are and what we're here to do, and our ability and power as creative, energetic beings. And we're stuck in this loop of, and there's a kind of I don't know a lot about it, but like even the Buddhist philosophy is like the death, rebirth, and reincarnation, and their whole purpose of their philosophy is to transcend the reincarnation cycle and the death rebirth cycle, and to get out of this trap of being stuck in this physical, dense experience of reality. And there's also like the Hindu philosophy of the yugas, which are these 4 cycles of consciousness. So there's like the golden age, silver age, bronze age, and it goes all the way down. And you can talk about this from all these different philosophies and different cultures throughout time. But we're going through what's called the Kali Yuga, which is the densest frequency of destruction and fear. And you need all these, you need the resistance and the experience of separation to know who you are. So it's this idea of the only way to know who you are is to know what you are not. And so going into this reality, we're kind of moving through this Kali Yuga phase, the dark ages, the last 2,000 to however many thousands of years, where it's like humanity is just trying to survive, and there's a lot of fear, a lot of scarcity. And it's really cool to witness that we're kind of moving through this great awakening, and we're coming back around to this golden age, and you can kind of feel it happening. More and more people in my life are starting to be more curious, be more open, and growing up, circling back, even the Christian philosophy and the prophecy of the second coming of Christ. If you look at the second coming of Christ as a frequency, and Christ consciousness as not a man coming back, not Jesus coming back in the sky to save his people, but this frequency that it lives within all of our hearts, that is going to be reawakened into this second coming of Christ, and this rapture and this transcendence and ascendance of these souls. Like all of it is pointing to the same thing, which is what we're moving through right now. And then we got,
Christianity is wild. I was raised Presbyterian, and then, whole long story, was Presbyterian, kind of went non-denominational, then kind of left, and through my own adventure, I've kind of like found my way back to the Bible. And something that I've found super fascinating is like what you're touching on right there, which is like, they talk about second coming of Christ, and this even ties into heaven and hell. But like what you're saying with context to the second coming of Christ, it's like, there's this almost dogmatic, literal application that has been applied to it in so many different ways, and it makes it difficult, because it's like, okay, you're telling me Jesus is literally going to come back, and I think that, to your point, I completely agree. I think it's that awakening within, the attainment of Christ to the highest good possible. That's what will, bring us out of the darkness, bring us out of the Kali Yuga, right? It's being able to find that way. And whenever people say, oh, like, Jesus said something along the lines of like, the path to God is through me, I don't truly think that means that you have to believe or know in Jesus Christ, but it's at least following the etiquette or the understanding of what enables someone to be of Christ vibration, let's say, in order for them to bring upon, heaven on earth. And even more so, this is where it gets interesting too, when you're talking about that wheel, is something I've always kind of played with, is like this idea of heaven and hell, right? Like traditionally, dogmatically, we think like, okay, heaven's above us and hell's below us. But the way that I've been starting to see it is almost like that earth, like this plane of existence, is hell. Like we were born into hell, and our job now is to, even with how much terribleness, how much torment, how much disease, how much poverty, how much evil there is in this physical plane of existence, we need to overcome it and purify ourselves. And I think this kind of goes back into reincarnation, where it's like, okay, you reap what you sow. And then once you're able to heal all of those things, and then not only heal all of those karmic debts, but then to enact, let's say, the divine presence of the Christ consciousness, that's when you're like, okay, now you're out of the rebirth cycle. You're on to, God or heaven or bigger and better things that aren't of this hell dimension.
Oh, there's a lot there, and a lot of different threads. I think what I'm starting to believe. So back to my analogy with the rope, right? Like if we're all one, and let's say we split off into these different fragments of consciousness, we have our own experience of an own perspective of God, but we're all like one. Like on the depth of my consciousness, like taking away all the stories of who I think I am and who the identity of Joe is. And this is why going through the big death process of letting go of such a massive identity of who I thought I was such a powerful experience, because it forced me to go deep into who I am and getting to the point of, holy cow, like at the very deepest level, me and you are the same thing. And there's these stories of who we think we are that are built up on top of that. And so what I believe as a collective humanity is, and it talks about this in the Joseph communications as well, is we're all a part of this fall experiment, if you will. And when you start waking up and you start connecting to that Christ consciousness in your heart, it creates this desire to be of service, this loving you as if you are me and I am you. And when you get to that level of consciousness, there's this knowing that it's not about me just ascending and leaving everybody behind. It's about me loving so deeply humanity and everybody I come in contact with such an open heart, because I know who they are underneath all of the pain, all of the suffering, all the disconnection, all the scarcity, all the fear, all the trauma, all the wounding. It's like I can see and feel your heart because I know I've been there. I'm here for you. And I truly believe as souls, as spirits, none of us are fully able to just ascend and like leave this experience through that death rebirth process until every last soul as a collective conscious, multi-perspective organism, being, energy field, whatever you want to call it, decides together to heal so profoundly that we're just deeply connected to our hearts. And so there's the story of, in Buddhist philosophy, of the bodhisattva, where these souls that they take a vow that they'll keep on reincarnating, even though they have, the potential to ascend into these higher states of being, these higher frequencies, these higher dimensions, but they're going to choose to keep coming back and continuing to infuse this level of consciousness with so much love until every single last soul walks through the door. And so there's these courageous beings that come back over and over to hold the door open for more and more people. And, I believe that's kind of what we're moving through. And back to the story of Jesus, it's like, if we can get to the depth of, I think we ask the wrong questions. Like we take so much, we're so connected to this book that it's like, this is the word of God, this is the truth, and I'm referring to the Bible. And to even just do a little bit of research on when the Bible was written and who wrote it, and it's not, it's interesting. And way after Jesus was even on earth, and we get so attached to the book, and I started contemplating, like, well, who is this Jesus character? Like, what was he actually teaching? What would he feel like? Who would he be like to be around if he was here standing next to me right now? And when I've, connected, because part of my journey, like I had so much resistance to Christ and the word Jesus and the word God and the Bible because of my upbringing. And it just created so much fear and shame and judgment that I had turned away from it pretty radically. And my curiosities and desire to seek truth for myself led me to, reading about all these different ancient religions and philosophies and Eastern mysticism and yoga practices and plant medicine and shamanism, but never, like, no, Jesus, no, I ain't gonna touch that. And it actually was my dad. My desire to reconnect with my dad and understanding, like, if I'm gonna connect with him with some of these things that are really resonating within my heart and expansion of my awareness and consciousness, and dropping into the love I have, it's like I got to speak his language. And so that actually got me into, okay, well, who is Jesus? How can I heal some of these resistances I have to the words that they use, like the Holy Spirit and all these things? And so I started really expanding my awareness and understanding of who Jesus was. What did he teach? What was he actually trying to convey and embody? And I get to a point, I was like, oh man, this guy was just embodying the presence of loving, like this loving frequency. Like he was just embodying that Christ consciousness within himself. And he didn't judge anyone. He loved them so fully. And there's all these stories of like these healings that Jesus did. It's like, if you've ever seen somebody that's just like super tapped in and super present and super loving, and they walk into a room and you're just like, man, there's like that. Why am I drawn to that person? Like, what is it about them? It's like they just carry a frequency. And if you think of that on like a more expanded, heart-centered, present, like to the nth degree, like imagine Jesus walking in just like fully embodied, like he looks at you and you're just like, whoa, like he like it just feel the love radiating off of him. What's that going to do with all this science coming out? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work with, like, he does these coherence healings and like a lot of tracking and science around the frequency and the vibration that we hold in our emotional state, and how, me and you are having this conversation and we're dropping into coherence. So like, if I can hold a loving frequency within my heart and be in the presence of others and like really see them and love them because I'm so present with them, that carries a frequency that could potentially really bring that person into coherence with my frequency. And so when I think about Jesus and these healings, it's like he's not like laying hands on people and has magic powers. He's embodying such a loving presence and a frequency that when you walk into his auric field, like boom, if you're there and ready to receive, and like you look at him and you feel like, holy cow, it's like that can realign your cells and your dis-ease and everything into this healed state of being. And I think that's really fascinating. And I think it's something that we all have the capability and power to embody within ourselves, dropping into the heart. But it's some deep work, because there's a lot of forgiveness, there's a lot of letting go, there's a lot of programming, there's a lot of collective wounding, not just to say your own individual traumatic experiences and unconscious patternings that you've grown up with through your own personal experience of life, but there's these collective traumas and woundings and war and programming and indoctrination. It's deep, it's a lot, and it's heavy. But it takes a lot of courage to show up and take it on. And I see a lot of people beginning to embody that courage, and you don't have to do it alone. Like, that's the one thing with Jesus. Like, he showed up and he fucking like anchored it in for humanity. Like, and there's a couple other like ascended master type souls, like the Buddha, like same thing. Like, they all were just embodying this frequency. And we're at this point now where we don't have to do it alone. Like, there's so many people that are starting to like connect with their hearts and connect with what really matters, and like the love and the unity, and we're all in this together. And so there's communities and allies and tribes all coming together, and it's like, okay, how do we show up and continue to connect into this coherent field of presence and love and bring more and more people in? And I think that's when you talk about like a great awakening, like that's what's taking place, and it's really, really quite exciting.
It's so exciting, and I'm seeing a really interesting parallel between our stories, but let's hone in on yours here with this idea of like, dropping into that heart center, right? This vibration. And I'm going to take you back and take this conversation and take it back to whenever you realized like you were no longer ready for not ready for the NFL. You were no longer going to be an NFL athlete. Like, you knew this was like your last year when you started telling, your ex-fiance, your parents, even your agent, like, okay, like I'm done, like this is it. And, that to me, it seems like, and of course, correct me where I'm wrong on these things, but to me, it seemed like you were speaking so much from your heart that it was radiating out. And it was almost as if there was this shell around you that was labeled as NFL player, and that knowledge of that internal knowledge of it no longer being a part of your external reality almost kind of shattered that outside veil. And it seems to me that the people around you, from your ex-fiance to your parents, quote unquote, no longer knew you, right? Who they thought Joe was no longer existed. And so how do you kind of see or even work through, that, let's say, that frequency shift that started within you that then even disrupted your outside world, right? Like I think if someone's listening to this, like that could probably be like a fear of someone's, right? Like, I'm going to lose friends if I am being more authentic to myself. And I know I've seen that in my life, where the more authentic I am to myself, it's lost some people along the way. So, I mean, what was that experience like for you? And, it kind of even ties into your courage. Like, how did you find the courage to even kind of move through that?
Yeah, there's a lot coming up for me here. So let me see if I can bring in a through thread, because it's like, yeah, I'll start with my fiance and this initial experience, and then kind of lead it through this deeper fear of rejection, which I believe is a seed that lives within all of us of this fear of rejection. And I'll get more into why that is, my own personal experience. But to your point, it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And with my experience with my fiance, it wasn't just this, we were together for 5 years and got engaged and just really deeply intertwined. And I think with a lot of relationships, it's quite fascinating how I found, whether you believe this or not, or if you've recognized it within your own relationships, these own patterns yet, but more than likely, I am pretty confident to say that you're going to attract in a partner a reflection of some type of dynamic that your parents embodied or went through. And so with me and my ex-fiance, we got to a point where, I was a super insecure guy. I was an offensive lineman. I was, 300 plus pounds and had some body dysmorphia stuff, still deal with that after losing, 60, 70 pounds. And we can get into that as well. But it just wasn't like although I was an NFL player, made all this money, like that had some deep insecurities and some deep shame. And it was all tied up into a lot of different things, the religion being one of them, society, culture, all of it. And it got to a point where, as I told my fiance, like, this is gonna be my last year playing, and she wasn't super supportive. It brought up this pattern that we had been experiencing our entire relationship. And really the breaking point was, we went to a couple different therapy sessions, and I got to a point where I understood, like, I'm not able to share my feelings without it turning into this big fight. And sitting with a therapist was like bringing awareness to, like, okay, I need to be able to share the little things and practice with the little things that are maybe not in alignment with me, or maybe they hurt my feelings, and low leverage situations to share, so that I can practice. Because otherwise, if I hold it in and I don't share those things that hurt my feelings, it builds up within me as resentment. And then it gets to a point where I can no longer hold it in. And then it's like a big blow up. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have experienced this. And so it's like, okay, little thing. She said she was going to do the dishes when I got home, and they weren't done. And this is like obviously a novel, like little, not like low leverage thing. It's like, okay, instead of not saying anything and being like, oh, she said she was going to do the dishes and she didn't. And like next time she doesn't do the dishes, and like builds up, instead of just being like, hey, you said you're going to do the dishes. Can you do it? And so I was like, okay, I'm going to practice that. But then what would happen is I'd go, hey, you said you're going to do the dishes, and you didn't. And then it would turn into this huge fight because she would get defensive, and like her patterning and like all of that would come up, and it would turn into this huge blow up. And I'm like, I can't get this right. Like I'm trying to practice these little things, but then it would turn into this big thing. And so that would create the story of like, I just won't say anything if it's a little thing because it's not that big a deal. So we got to a point, anyway, I'm painting all that picture because we got to a point where I was, probably halfway through my final season, and I was sitting down and I was trying to practice this thing, and like a similar experience. I don't remember exactly what it was that happened. And she blew up at me, and I felt so defeated and so like shut down. And I had this moment of, man, I'm just not gonna say anything. I gave up. it was this feeling of giving up. Like, I'm just not going to ever say how I feel because it's just not worth it. It turns into this huge thing. And in that moment, I had this whole flash forward of what my life would turn out like, like right before my eyes. And I saw me sitting in as my dad, sitting in front of my mom, like 20, 30 years before, and how he had a similar choice right in that moment of, I'm going to give
Whoa.
up and be defeated. And I said, no, I'm not going to make that choice. I can make a different choice here. And I love this woman so much, but I can't, and I don't know if I had the language for it at this time, but I can only love somebody to the extent that I love myself. And I love this woman more than I love myself. And I'm willing to like just give up my vibrancy, my life, my future, like everything I want to create because I love this woman and I just don't want to hurt her. So I'm just going to like not care about how I feel. And I was like, no, I need to make a different choice. And that was the anchor point of when I knew like I need to break this off, and it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do, was like ripping my own heart out.
And as a
And
quick question, did you ever ask your dad if that was a thing that he had to encounter or like overcome in his life, or like something that like that vision that you had? Did you ever confirm with him or ask him about that?
yeah, so me and my dad don't have a super tight relationship. And I can get into more of that as well. But we never really discussed it. I think the way I could paint some context for that is I had these moments when I was like in high school and I was younger where my mom is a little bit, she's emotionally manipulative and emotionally abusive, I would say, and um, a little bit narcissistic. And so that entered that dynamic. Like I saw it so clearly in my dad. And I had, a lot of people in high school, like their parents get divorced, and it's a really challenging thing. I had this story. I remember when I was in high school, I was like, I would respect my dad more if he got a divorce, because then he would actually
Hmm.
stand up for himself. But it was like every time I wanted to do something, I like go to my dad, like, go ask your mom, go ask your mom. And he would always so it was like my dad didn't have any say in our family
Right.
dynamic. Like my mom was the king of the household. And so as a son, like I wanted that connection with my dad, like, dad, like let's father son this thing, like, but I never had that. And so
Mm,
that's how that affected me, is my mom. It was always about my mom. And so seeing that in my relationship was like, this woman is a little bit narcissistic, and she's a little bit emotionally manipulative and abusive. And it's interesting how people find each other with these patterns. And on a spiritual level, like we're just mirrors so that we can see these things as reflections so that we can work on them within ourselves. And so the challenge there, and I think this is where a lot of people get stuck, is you have to go on your own journey of self-discovery. You can't be a victim of like, this person's doing to this to me. Like there's something within me that's allowing this to happen. And the boundary is like, I need to sever this connection. And there, until I sever that connection, it will actually create an opportunity of maybe we can come back together. But if we stay in the energy dynamic, it's never going to get resolved or healed. And I think if I'm, obviously these patterns still come up with me and my wife now. They're a little bit more subtle, and we have more awareness so that we can come together and like, okay, there's something off here. Like, let's grow together and work on it together. At that point in that relationship, it was like, I was so attached to this beautiful woman that like, and I was scared of being abandoned and like all these different woundings that came in. And so I made that decision to break it off because I didn't want to end up like my dad. And I knew that I had to figure out who I am. And I realized, like, how can I expect these people in my life to love me for who I am when I don't even know who I am? And so I was able to like really connect with that and go on this journey of like, I need to figure out who I am before I get into any type of relationship with anyone. And who is Joe Hawley underneath this identity of a football player? And until I figured that out, I couldn't expect anybody else in my life to figure that out for me.
right. And I think there was also a moment, or maybe two moments. I know one in particular. I'm not sure which point it was in your timeline, but whenever you were essentially the 54th man on the roster, and they like called you into the office to cut you. And I remember you talking about this. There was a moment there, and I'd love to hear your words of it, but you actually vocalizing it and how it actually prolonged your NFL career.
Yeah, standing up for myself for the first time. Yeah, I mean, so to paint that picture,
Do you think
this
that
is
was the
really
first
cool.
time that you ever stood up for yourself? I guess also.
Yeah, there was probably a few moments, like definitely the biggest turning point where that experience was, because I think the first great awakening everybody has to go through, the first one is taking responsibility for where you're at in life, like radical responsibility, like going from that lens of life is happening to me to life is happening for me. And that shift right there is so profound. And it's the initial thing that, like, if you think you're a victim of your circumstance, and everybody goes through all sorts of different things, but until you start taking responsibility, and back to my story with my fiance, like I could have either given up and been like, oh, I'm just like, this is just my life. But taking responsibility was the hardest decision in that moment. It was like, if I'm taking responsibility, I have to actually pull myself out of this relationship and destroy like all of my connection to relationships by like disconnecting myself, not just from the relationship, but from football and all that took into that. And so this was my initial, and there's like little things that happened throughout my career was like my ego in football would get a little bit too big because I was always, the best player on the team. And like sometimes I act like my shit doesn't stink, and my coach would have to give me like a kind of a little bit of a ego check. And so there's like these little things, but this was like the biggest moment. What happened was, I going into my third year, the starting center was set to retire. He was a 14-year vet, and they drafted me to kind of replace him. And that's the story I had. And so I was kind of waiting for him to retire and not really going out and taking the job and like earning the job. And it was just, this young player just like, okay, I'm here, and this guy's been around a long time, so I'm going to wait. And so he was set to retire, and going into that offseason, I was the number one center on the roster, and I was just creating this narrative of like, okay, it's my job. Like, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to have my own 10 plus year career, and this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. And going into that year's draft, I'll kind of summarize the story. Is we ended up drafting the top center in college football, and it felt like the rug was ripped out from under me, and that created this downward kind of victim spiral where, I was kind of blaming everyone else, pointing the finger, like the strength coach doesn't like me, the head coach doesn't really understand, like they're going to figure it out at some point because this guy's not as good as me, and just like this projection and this victim mindset. And that led to, alcohol abuse, taking pills. And, I think my definition of abusing those types of things is so much different now. It wasn't like super destructive, but I was definitely using these things to cope in an unhealthy way. And I mean, in a way, back then, I would say it was destructive in the fact that I was just like numbing out. Started showing up in my body language and the way I was showing up to the facility, and ended up leading to me getting suspended for a PED drug test, and got suspended for 4 games. And so it's just like on this downward spiral. I was like, okay, when I got suspended, it was like this awakening of, okay, like, wow, I got to really like pull myself out of here. Like, this is not leading in the right direction. And so when you referred to the 54 men on the roster, so those that watch football, there's 53 people on the roster. But when someone gets suspended, when I came back from my suspension for that week, the team is able to have 54 on the roster to make a decision. So they don't have to make a decision, right away. They can fill in too, because when I was suspended, they brought in another practice squad guy from a different team to replace me on the roster for those 4 weeks. So when I came back, they got to make a decision, and they had made the decision that they were going to cut me. And when I went into the front office, this is week 15 or 16. We're like 12-2 at the time, going to be the number 1 seed in the playoffs, like having a very successful year. All the while, like, I feel disconnected from the team. I'm depressed. I don't feel like I'm contributing because I'm on the sidelines. And so I didn't get to really feel a part of that run and that success. And, I went into this meeting where they were going to cut me, and I knew what was going to happen. And so going in there, I'm like, I'm going to tell them like how I feel. Like, I'm not just going to like roll over and take this. Like, I'm a good football player, and they just don't see that. And nobody's really communicated with me what's going on, because nobody like said, hey, Joe, like, you look like your body language is kind of shitty. Like, you're kind of on this downward trajectory. Like, is everything okay? Like, nobody presented that to me or came and like worried about me. It was just like, I felt like isolated, alone. That's one of the issues I think with the NFL as part of bigger kind of systemic cultural thing within the NFL of not really communicating in that way. And I think that's a part of a bigger societal issue that we face. It's just a microcosm within the NFL. So I went in kind of prepared to speak my mind, and something really fascinating happened when I sat down and they said the words. Like, I knew it was coming, but they're like, Joe, we've decided we're going to let you go. And in that moment, it was like, oh, I was flooded with this feeling of regret. And that regret was like all of that victim mindset of like pointing the finger, like, it's this person doesn't like me, this person doesn't know, and like outside of myself. What that regret did was like it flooded all of that energy back into myself. And I was like, oh my God, like this feels so icky, because I knew that I didn't do the things I knew I needed to do to be my best. There was things that immediately came into mind of like, oh, I could have worked harder. I could have shown up and practiced harder. I could have tried to improve my leadership. I could have ate better. Like all these things started going in. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be on the street, squandered my dream, and nobody gives a fuck. And I'm going to be sitting with all this feelings of regret. Like, I don't like this. And so I was able to speak my mind for the first time, which was like an out of body experience, because it was just like, I'm on the way out. There's nothing to lose at this point. And so I asked them a question. I said, if you guys are going to be the number one seed in the playoffs, and if the starting center gets hurt in the first round, would you trust this new guy that you brought in to take you to the Super Bowl, or would you trust me? And they sat with that for a little bit. They're like, I guess we'll have to trust the other guy. I'm like, okay. So I went through the whole cut process, and about 15 minutes into it, I was about to sign the last papers. They called me back into the office and they said, Joe, we thought about what you said, and we're going to keep you on the roster as the 53rd man. And you're going to have to work your way back up, but we're going to give you a second chance. And in that moment, everything in my life changed, because I promised myself, like, there's going to be a day when I'm no longer playing this game that I love, but I do not want to feel any ounce of regret that I could have given it more. And I want to walk away on my own terms. And so I ended up really like going into that off season and like shifted everything. Like, I was the first one in the weight room. I was working hard. My mindset, it was like my first experience of like becoming the creator of my reality and shifting my circumstance, not being a victim of my circumstance, but really showing up and trying to shift them. And there's still a lot of ups and downs, but it changed my foundational belief that I'm going to do everything I can. And if that's not good enough, I can live with that, but at least I'm going to try. And I ended up playing another 5 years. I started in another 35 games and made enough money to ended up, retiring when I did.
It's crazy. And you feel like that was the biggest point where you're like, oh, I need to stand up for myself. Like, this is going to change everything.
Yeah. And part of that responsibility piece was like, going into that off season is when I was blessed enough to play with one of the greatest tight ends ever to play the game of football, which is, his name's Tony Gonzalez. He played 17 years. He's the first ballot Hall of Famer. And that season he was retiring, and his final game of his career, it was the following year. And he, I think we were like, 4-12 or something. We ended up missing the playoffs. And so his final game, the Saturday before the game, he got up, and he wasn't a big rah speech guy, but he like felt called to, because he had such an illustrious career, to say a few words to the team. And he basically talked about how he found success in his life and why he made it so far. And he said three things that had a direct impact on his life and his success. And I forget what the other two were. There was probably one where it was around taking responsibility, I'm sure, which is fascinating that we're talking about that. But one of the things out of these three things that he swore by, one of them was reading books. And I was like, I found that fascinating. Like, reading books is why this guy's so successful, and he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. And it's like, is that even tied to like his athletic ability? And
you can't catch a football with a book.
Yeah, exactly. And so I text him that offseason. I said, hey man, like, part of me taking responsibility is like, if I want to be the best version of me, and this guy is telling me what made him the best version of him, then I gotta figure this out. And so I text him, and I'm like, hey man, like, curious, like, what are some books that I should read that have had an impact on your life? And he shared a few different books, but one of the books he shared with me was the first book I read from start to finish, was called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And it was the one kind of shared it. Did I share about that earlier?
Yeah, we talked about it briefly.
We talked about it briefly. Yeah. So that book like changed my life, and it started opening my mind. And it led me on this path, like the initial awakening of it wasn't really the taking responsibility was not like a spiritual thing at that time. Like I wouldn't have connected to anything. Like it was just going from putting things outside myself to like, okay, I like bringing it back in. But that's what led me on this path of like curiosity, open-mindedness, and how do I like continue to improve? And that's what led me down this path of really where I'm at now, which is like, whoa, like radical responsibility and accessing these deeper levels. Yeah.
It's pretty crazy. And my mind's going back now because I feel like we took this thread pretty far, and I think there's a bow here that we need to put on, which is about the grief aspect in regards to the way that the external world was putting you in a box, let's say, or putting you in the skin of NFL player, the mold of NFL player. This is who he is, right? And I think we touched on it a little bit, but I feel like there was still a little something, right? Because we were talking about how men specifically don't deal with their grieving. We don't deal with our processing of especially disidentification with a very manly thing, right? Being an NFL player. So what, I mean, maybe if there's tools, or even can you help us to help me to understand, like, how did grieving help in releasing the attachment of that persona? And then, I mean, even more, being okay with releasing the people who are closest to you.
Yeah, there's a lot here, right? Because we talked about a little bit about the emotions we carry in our soma, in the somatic experience, and where we store emotions when they're unprocessed. And so I think the best way to talk about it is from a personal experience and story, and one of my biggest kind of traumatic experiences of my life, and how that stuff gets stored in the unconscious, and you don't really realize how it affects your life and how it affects your everyday and your pattern and your triggers, and it's this deeper exploration and healing process that we all need to go on of really excavating some of this stuff. And there's also a trust of when the time is right, this stuff will be presented, but then having the tools to actually go into it and not keep suppressing it. And so I'll share an experience that I'm only now recently able to really even talk about publicly. So when I was 19, I had this experience happen to me. And, I went to this session with this woman who's she's a psychosomatic, spiritual kind of healer, psychologist. It's like all these like different therapeutic models into one. And I laid on her table, and she was recommended to me. And she does this really, like, she taps into kind of your spirit, your higher self, and is able to communicate. She does this like weird muscle testing thing where she can like communicate basically with your body and with your psyche and with your unconscious. And she's like, "Oh, this is interesting." She's like, immediately right when I lay down, I don't know this woman at all. She says, "Oh, something happened when you were 19 that affected your leadership journey." And the fact that she said leadership journey is really fascinating because she doesn't know me, but this has been a big part of my kind of life path is learning how to lead. And so I'm thinking, so I sit there, and part of this thing is like, she's not telling me, like, she's allowing me to explore my own unconscious. And so I'm like, I go in and I'm like, okay, what happened when I was 19? And immediately there was this moment that happened with my mom when I was playing football. And I was like, no. And it was fascinating. My ego was like, no, that can't be it. Like, and so I tried to find, I kind of searched my unconscious and like, blank, and it kept leading back to, no, this is it. And so I told her, I was like, I think there was this thing that happened when I was 19 with my mom and football. And then she kind of did her little muscle test to like check in. She's like, yep, that's it. She's like, what happened? And I was like, okay, when I was 19, it's my sophomore year of college, and I was growing my hair out. And one of my roommates had long hair, and he was like kind of Rico Suave, and he was really cool. And I was like, I want to grow my hair out, and this is like my second year outside the house. I'm 18, like really stepping into my own, freedom and sovereignty, and like outside of my parents' household. And I'm in college, so I'm growing my hair out, and it's kind of getting to that just past the ugly stage, and I could put it into a bun, but I couldn't put it into a full ponytail yet. And so during spring training, my parents were visiting, and I had my hair up in a bun to keep it out of my eyes when I had my football helmet on, and it's like sweaty and hot out there. And so I was just keeping it up. And my mom had said multiple times, like, she's like, you need to you need to cut your hair. Like, it looks gross. Like, you shouldn't do it. And I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter. Like, I'm my own man now. And so I think there's like obviously a power dynamic here of like my mom
For sure.
not able to let her kid kind of step into himself. And, I didn't know this at the time. I'm young. I'm still a kid. And so I'm watching, after one of the practices, we're in the big team auditorium as an offensive line watching film from the practice on the big screen. And this is my sophomore year going into my junior season. So I'm a starter. I've started my whole sophomore year. I was a little player my freshman year too. So I was becoming one of the leaders on the team. So a lot of the players looked up to me. I was one of the best players on the team at this point. And I'm watching film, and all of a sudden I feel this hand come up behind me, grab my hair, and scissors come, and my hair gets cut off.
Oh no.
And I turn around, and my mom's standing there with my hair in her hand, and my dad's standing next to her. And I stand up, and I have this experience, like I stand up and I want to punch my mom in the face. Like, I'm just like raging. And it's a really confusing moment because this is my mom. Like, this is a woman I love, like, deeply. I was a mama's boy growing up, and I want to like hurt her physically really bad, but I can't because I love her. And so it's just really confusing. And then I like slowed down, and like, so that initial rage, like, I suppressed real quick because I didn't know how to express it. And then all of a sudden all my teammates started laughing. So then I felt humiliated. I'm like, oh man, like, this is like humiliating. Like, I don't know what to do. My mom's here. Why is she here? And then I look at my coach, and then I felt deep betrayal. Like, this is supposed to be a safe space for me to be with my team. Like, why is my parent, like my mom and my dad, even in here? Why are they allowed in here? And so I like looked at my coach, and he obviously had let them in, and maybe they talked about it beforehand, and they thought it was a big joke. So I was like feeling like betrayed, humiliated, like rejected, like all the wounds wrapped up in one. And I just sat down, and I just like closed off, and I just stood there. I just sat there in my own internal world. My mom was like, oh, like she was trying to like say like, oh, it's like, it's just a joke. It's not that big a deal. And I just like didn't say anything. And I just sat there, and then they ended up walking out. And back to this session with this woman, I was taking her through this, and she took me through a process of, it's similar to like a reparenting, right? So this trauma lived deep in my unconscious. I hadn't really thought about it because it was too much energy to even like think about. I could talk about it from like this dissociated third person kind of perspective, like, and that was the fascinating thing too, is like as I've gone on this healing journey, a lot of us look to like when I was 5 or 6 years old or 7 years old, like I don't have a lot of childhood memories, so like maybe something traumatic happened to me, but I don't know, like let me go explore. This one was when I was 19. I was fully aware that it happened to me, but because it was so intense and traumatic at the time, like I wasn't able to access the emotions that I felt, but I could talk about it from this head place. And so what this woman, this therapist, helped me process was, okay, what were you feeling? Like, how does that 19-year-old part of yourself feel? And when I was able to like create safety within myself, and with this woman facilitating this experience, I was allowing that emotion to come to the surface. And I just broke into this deep grieving process. Like all that anger, all that rage, all that energy that I wasn't able to process in time started coming to the surface. And I just started like wailing and crying, and it was just super, super intense. And in that process of just feeling those emotions, I felt all this unconscious resentment and anger that I had towards my mom that I didn't even know. Because part of the question was like, why do I feel so disconnected from my mom? Like, why does she trigger me so much? And what I realized is this experience had created this unconscious resentment towards her that was always underlying our relationship. And because I was able to feel in that emotional grieving process, like I felt the resentment and anger like dissipating, and it turned into forgiveness. I was like, oh, and then compassion for like, oh, my mom didn't know, like, and realizing like she did that because of her own wounding and her own trauma. And like, I was able to like really start forgiving because I was able to feel these emotions. And, this woman was able to support me and like, okay, what did you need in that moment that you didn't receive? I was like, well, I needed a hug. I needed someone to tell me like, it's okay. Like, you're safe. And I was able to offer that to myself. And so I comforted that part of myself with the tools that I had in that moment, not in that moment of when I was 19, but when this happened probably like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And so I was able to like reparent and re-nurture myself and give myself the comfort and safety that I wasn't receiving, obviously, from my coach, my teammates, my parents in that moment. And all that emotion was a deep, deep process. And it was very, very healing. And my mom didn't need to be there for that to happen. It was a forgiveness of her through the emotional process that I was moving through. And what was really beautiful about that is I was able to tell my mom about it. Like a few weeks later, I was sitting down with her. And I was like, "Hey, I want to tell you about something. Like, remember when 19 when you cut my hair off in front of everyone?" And I went to this. I called her a therapist because that's language that my mom would understand. She's a little
Sure.
bit more than that. There's like a spiritual component, but because of my mom's belief structure with Christianity and stuff, like I wanted to just make it really normalized. I was like, I went to this therapist, and she helped me access that experience and how it affected me. And I was able to share it with my mom in this very like forgiving and free way, where it wasn't like there wasn't any unconscious like, why'd you do that to me? It was like pure forgiveness. And I just shared, I was able to feel the emotions that came up within me, and it was really hard. And I just want you to know, like, I love you and I forgive you. And my mom was just like crying, and like, she I held space for her as she like processed like all the guilt and shame that she was carrying unconsciously because she did that to me and because she hurt me, and she knew that that was not something that she probably regretted. And she texted me later that night on her way home, and she's like, "Hey, I just want you to know, like, I feel so much lighter, and I feel in a way free of that because, and that's how forgiveness works. A lot of us think like, forgiveness is like the person needs to say sorry to me or they need to own what they did. But because I was able to feel those emotions and forgive her for what she did, she was able to let go of the guilt and regret and shame that she felt, at least a little bit, like let a little bit of the steam out. And that experience that we went through together is no longer between us. And I think there's a lot of other deeper layers that we're continuing to work through. But I think that's a good story to kind of encapsulate the grieving process that and the healing process that it's very complex and nuanced, and it's unique to all of us. And these experiences that we have that live in our unconscious that we don't even know are there, being able to go to a therapy session or a psychosomatic, breath work's really good for this, like releasing emotional stored up energy. And sometimes we need to feel energy that we don't even have a story of why it's there. Like we go to a breath work. I've had experiences where I've, accessed, emotional releases through breath work that I don't have a story of why I'm feeling grief, but in the process of grieving, I feel lighter. It's very cathartic. And so there's just a lot of power in being able to learn how and develop the tools to really feel our emotions and the depth of emotions. And when you go into a deep grieving process, it's very vulnerable. And if you're not doing it, that's why it's important to seek out, professionals who can create a safe, sacred space for you to access it. Because when you go into it, it's a very vulnerable experience.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks for sharing, man, because I know the power. I mean, I was kind of taken there. I started tearing up a little bit, so I was definitely taken to that place that you were. And I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's deeply vulnerable. I mean, I can feel how much energy was behind that, how much of an imprint that, like, especially whenever it's a story to the point of you're 19 years old and don't even remember it. Like, that's something that you're getting to another layer of even understanding yourself or um, the world around you, if you will. And I mean, I think it's even more beautiful because it touches on the butterfly effect, which when it's like when you heal something, you kind of heal the world of it. All right. And then you going through the process of even helping your mom through it. It's like, hey, like, I know you were operating with the best tools you had. You had your programming that brought you into this situation that, now I'm here to show you that it's okay. Like we can move on from it. We can heal this patch, and keep moving forward. And I think that that's, and maybe we can we can kind of get this to a maybe a little bit more esoteric of almost like it feels like at some level that's what we're all here to do. At some level we're here to help somebody else, help other people. And I know at some level, like even starting this podcast, it's like, how do I know what I'm doing is even helping anyone? It's like, okay, well, you're helping yourself. You're learning something about yourself. I'm like, okay, cool. And then it's like, even that at some level, like sharing that story is going to help somebody else, to help them to open up and even see their world in a new way. And it even seems like there's even something, and this might be even the more esoteric, is like how we feel lighter after allowing those things to, we like forgive them, or we like, grieve through them, we process them, that ability to relax the nervous system in some aspect of the world. And it's, it kind of goes back to how we store all this stuff throughout the body. Because I know one of my big processes that I moved through was like this sexual trauma I had when I was a kid. And you like think about it, but you're like, oh, it didn't really matter. It wasn't really a big deal. Like that happened, but it's like, it's okay that it happened. I know that's wrong. But it's like, once you fully process it, like that lightness. And it seems that there's at least something there with, feeling lighter, in a sense, metaphorically and maybe even literally, brings you closer to heaven. It brings you closer to that angelic state. And even just to tie this back into the Bible, or even this esoteric nature, it's like that, if you're able to continuously let those things go, or to, maybe heal those karmic imprints in a way, it like brings you to that higher place. And I think like we probably at a micro scale probably feel these every single day, but whenever you have like a huge one like that, where it's like this huge imprint and you just release it instantaneously, you feel that shift upwards, that you feel that shift towards being more of God, of soul, of spirit, kind of quicker in your body.
Yeah. There's a couple of things here. I think one of the things you said of, when we look at past experiences from our level of consciousness now, it's like we can justify like, that wasn't that big a deal. Like if that happened to me now, like I would just, I'd laugh at it. It wasn't like, it's not a traumatic thing to me now. But when you're 6, 8, 9, 19 even, and you don't have the tools to process that experience in that moment, that imprint still lives within you. And you need to work on it from the level of consciousness that you went through it at. And so if you're 6 years old and you go through something that it wouldn't affect you when you're older, but it like, imagine the level of a 6-year-old, like not feeling safe in whatever experience, or feeling even just uncomfortable, or, something as simple as, when you're a kid and your parents leave for the weekend and you stay at your grandma's, and your grandma's a little weird and you don't really like it, and like you feel like your parents abandoned you, like you can think about as a parent and leaving your kid, you're like, oh, it's like not that big a deal. We'll be back soon, honey, and it's like, but that gets stored in the unconscious of like that level of feeling isolated, alone, abandoned, like is very real for that part of you that still lives within your unconscious. And so I just want to speak to that, because I think it's really important that when you're going on this healing journey, to like really be patient and compassionate with yourself, and to know that these, even if the most seemingly trivial experience, can still imprint in a very powerful way. And talking about, circling back to what we were talking about earlier with like, what is it to access freedom? What does freedom really mean? And freedom isn't something that is outside yourself. Like freedom is really letting go of these and healing these deeper experiences. And so going through that grieving process, I didn't even know how much that experience was really affecting my relationship with my mom obviously, but like my leadership journey, like circling back to that, like I felt so much shame and like just really embarrassed in front of all my teammates that affected my entire leadership journey for the rest of my football career into the NFL. I had a fear of like, man, these people aren't going to respect me because like this thing happened to me in my unconscious. I didn't even know that's what was affecting me. But there was moments in my career where I didn't lead in the way that I knew I was capable of, because of this fear and this unconscious pattern and experience that was affecting me. And so if you're on this path of really desiring, freedom, it's easy to talk about, the oppressive nature of our culture and society, and individual oppression and all this stuff. And it's like, yes, and that's another thing with this healing and how complex and nuanced it is like there's those individual experiences you've gone through, but then there's also this collective wounding that we're all being called to heal and let go of as well. And that's just some really, really deep work. But if you're on the path to really, wanting to find freedom, it's go inward and really recognize what you're holding on to and what's harboring, deep unconscious energies and resentment and anger and grief that is unprocessed, and being able to go into that and feel it and let it go. That's how you really begin to access deeper levels of freedom within yourself.
Yeah, as being able to, and I mean, even more so, I mean, there's maybe these mental restrictions that we place on ourselves without even, knowing it. I mean, for even within your story, right, of how that, impacted your leadership journey, right? Because it's a very specific terminology. And it was interesting because I know in the podcast I was hearing on Kyle's, it was like you were very much a leader in every regard. And so it really begs the question. It's like, well, how much even more of a leader could you have been, or can you be, in this new path of your life, right? Because I mean, maybe you weren't, if you were a quote unquote better, an even better leader, let's phrase it that way, in the NFL, maybe it would have lasted longer. But at the same time, it's like, can you actually fulfill your entire, let's say, mission or purpose on earth if you're in the NFL for 15 years versus like, this new path that you're carving out? And maybe this is a good part to even transition into, because I know at one point I wanted to discuss like, okay, you climb to the top of the mountain of being an NFL player, and now you're not, I mean, maybe it was a while ago, but now you kind of have to start something new, right? Because you've got at least 30, 40 years left in life. And it's like, okay, how, like, this mentality of restarting new and even finding something that you love as much, if not more, than football. Like what is that journey even look like from your perspective?
Yeah, man, this is such good little flows. Yeah, I mean, part of the grieving process, to kind of follow that thread into finding deeper purpose and meaning outside of this thing that I spent my life pursuing, was, when to get esoteric with grief. And I think why people are so challenged by feeling grief, because grief naturally on the surface is like, it's like a feeling of loss, it's a feeling of a void, it's feeling hurt, um, and it's when we love something and we lose it that creates grief. And so with that experience with my mom, on a very foundational level, I was grieving because I didn't have the tools to process that grief at the moment, but I felt hurt by my mom. Like, I loved my mom, I thought she loved me, and this experience made me feel like that love was taken away and she didn't love me in the way that I thought. And so back to football, like, I loved the game of football so much. I remember when I was younger, like, I was like, I don't know what the big fuss is about. I'd play this game for the rest of my life for free, because it was
Mm.
like the innocence and the purity and the competition. And I loved the game of football, and I played it with that love, and played it with my heart. And it's what part of the reason I got so far is because I loved it so much. And when it became a business and the money was involved, and the having to prove myself constantly, and the performance anxiety, and then the physical pain and the brutality of the sport, and the having to stand up for myself and telling, you know shifting and having to, like, earn it in all these different ways, and it didn't become about the game anymore. It became about all the business involved in the game. And so part of the grieving process that I needed to go through was, when I decided to walk away, I was walking away from the business of the NFL that I believe stripped away and took away the love and the innocence I had for football. And so part of the grieving process was, um, grieving the loss of the love that I had for football because of the NFL, similar to my mom doing that to me and feeling like she didn't love me. Is like, oh, the business did that to me, and it disconnected me from the love and the innocence I had to football. And the interesting thing about grief is, if you allow yourself, and if you've had any deep grieving process and you fully surrender into the depth of grief and that emotion, and just, like, not fighting the tears or like feeling the energy and like suppressing it, but like, okay, I'm gonna go into this. And you like dive into the grief and you allow yourself to surrender fully into it. Something really magical happens in that process. And it's what I experienced with my mom, and it's what I experienced with the process of grieving the loss of football, is as I've gone into the depth of that grief, within that grief lives the very love that you feel like you've lost. And so if you like to look at it as a tool, if I'm feeling grief, if I can go in to that grief, that's where I'm going to find the love again. And that's where the healing takes place. And so with the experience of my mom, like as I was feeling that grief and that unconscious anger and resentment was releasing, it was like I got to the depth of this seed of love that was living within that grief. And when I got to it, it was like this radical forgiveness of all the things that were getting in the way of that love, which is what the grief is built on. And so with football, that was the same thing. It was like I need to go in, and that process takes time. Takes sometimes years, and I'm still, just now starting to really integrate that. Like this is the first season I'm like really excited to watch the game again, and like I love the game, and I connecting with the innocence and the love that I had for it. But in order to get there, I really had to process that in a deep way. And so, yeah, your question was to like, how do I find purpose and deeper meaning? And that's been one hell of a journey, and I think that's really the journey we're all on. And society puts these ideas and this programming of what success looks like, what happiness looks like, what's going to make you feel fulfilled, and creates this never-ending insatiable desire to fill the void that we have living within us with these external things. And until we go on the journey of really uncovering and finding that truth within our own heart, is we'll continue to search and seek. And that searching and seeking allowed me, it's the paradox, like you need to go on the journey of seeking and finding your truth in order to find that it's been within you the whole time. And so there's this paradoxical nature of that. There's nothing wrong with the seeking and outside oneself, but you have to go on that journey to get to a point where you realize, no matter how long it takes, that the only thing to really fill that void is from within. And that is what's required is really self-love and loving yourself. And I was part of the process of letting go of, with my relationship and my fiance, is like, I'm going to get to a point where, I'm going to be with somebody, but I need to know that I'm not looking for them to fill a void within myself. I need to find that truth, that love, that connection, that happiness, that fulfillment within myself, and not putting that weight onto somebody else to fill that void for me, or whether it's a job too, or this job is going to make me feel like I have purpose. And it gets to the point of like the esoteric concept of like, it's not about what you do, it's about how you be, right? And your being. And that's a journey that I continue to oscillate through, because we live in a society and culture that's constantly bombarding us with comparison and money and the way the system works and the ideas of like success. And so it's a constant journey, and that's why the tools and the practices daily are so important. And I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm still trying to create, and I'm getting to a point now where I'm doing it from a place of joy and creation, and I'm doing my best not to attach to the outcome of, if my business fails, what does that mean about me? Like, can I create it and not be attached to what I need it to be, because it reflects who I am, and just really embodying that. And I think that moves into what I was kind of talking about earlier, into this deep wound that I've been working on very recently. It was this fear of rejection, and this rejection wound. And it's been so deep and powerful, and the very foundational root of, I think, all of my trauma. And I think if I look at it collectively, it's a shared foundational root to all of our spiritual wounding too, is this feeling of rejection. And with my faith upbringing with Christianity, and the idea of what I was taught God is, like, there's a foundational part of me feeling rejected by God and rejected by the experience. And because we're in separate perspectives, and I talked about the story of the fall and the amnesia of forgetting that we are all divine connected to the divine beings, is we all inherently feel this rejection from source and this rejection from the greater self. And that showed up in and manifest in my family dynamic. And so with my dad, because I never really felt connected to him, had this fear because of their belief structure that if I showed up and was embodying my authentic self and my curiosity and all these questions, that part of me was being rejected by them. And so what that created is this fear of being rejected by others. And so it's fascinating how that affected my leadership journey as well. Is I didn't step up as a leader because I had this fear of like, if I say something and then I get rejected, it's going to be really hurtful. And so what that did, that fear, and this is what fear kind of does because it wants to protect us, is it manifested the very thing I was scared of. And instead of me stepping into my leadership and risking the potential of being rejected first before that could happen, I just rejected myself. I rejected that part of myself. And so there's been this underlying story in my life unconsciously that I'm going to play small because I don't want to be rejected. And that's how that showed up in my leadership journey. And I had this experience just very recently. It was like a few months ago when I sat down with my dad and I asked him for support. And, I bought this property 90 minutes outside of town, and I put a lot of my resources in investing in it and remodeling it. And there was long story short, I had a big cost. I had to redo the whole HVAC. And so I wanted to get a home improvement loan so I could home improvement loan. But because I didn't have pay stubs and a traditional job, I couldn't get a loan. So I went to ask my dad to help support and co-sign this loan for me. And I thought it would be an easy way for him to support me. And I sat down with him, and it basically led into this really intense experience where I felt super rejected by him. He said, I'm not going to support you. I don't believe in what you're doing. I don't think you know what you're doing. And I felt really rejected by him. And it led to like all this really deep anger and resentment that I was feeling. And I left the house, I left the conversation, feeling really intense. And I reflected on that. I'm like, what am I feeling? Like, why is all this present now? And as I contemplated that, I was like, oh, I'm realizing like I always had this fear of being rejected by my dad, really. And what that did was it made me wear a lot of these subtle masks of who I thought I needed to be to receive love from him. And what's fascinating, if you circle back to my whole journey in football and how I reached the pinnacle of success and really became one of the best in the world, like the underlying driver of that ability and capability to push myself to that level of success was because I thought if I could find that level of success, my dad would finally love me. My dad would finally approve of me. My dad would finally, accept me. And I got to a point where when I reached that level, like we were more disconnected than ever. And then I let it all go. And I said, okay, that wasn't it. So then I went on this path of really like uncovering these deeper truths and really allowing myself to explore who I am. And as I started unraveling and uncovering like the truth of who I am, there was still a part of me that was really scared of being rejected for that. And, even like talking about sharing that story with my mother and sharing this experience with my dad, why it's been so challenging for me to share about that. And even like my spiritual beliefs and the things I'm learning, like being on a podcast like this, is like, if my dad or my parents hear me talk about this stuff, like they don't accept it, approve of it. And so they reject that part of me. And so I've realized like, dang, I feel rejected. And so I went down to Peru like 2 months ago on this deep pilgrimage, and I worked with some plant medicine down there. And it really helped me process the grief of and really this letting go of who I needed my parents to be for me, like this projection of needing to be approved by my father and needed to be accepted by my father, and realizing like no matter what I do, he's not going to accept me, he's not going to approve of me, he's not going to love me for who I am. And knowing that's because he doesn't know who he is, and he doesn't love himself, and he doesn't accept himself, and it's all buried under these deep unconscious patterns. So I'm not saying it's like he's consciously doing this out of like spite or anything. Like
Sure.
within all of this, I can see the love I have that especially because I have a son now. Like, I know my dad loves me, but there's a part of him that can't see me, can't accept me, because I to him is a reflection of where he is falling short of reaching his fullest potential. And so for him to hang on to his own story of limited like potential is too much for him to see that reflection in me. And so he rejects me, which is just really him rejecting himself. And so as I've gone, when I went down to Peru, I was able to really access those emotions and let that idea of who I needed my parents to be, I let it die. And in that death process was a deep amount of grief. But what happened was really beautiful, because in that process, I was able to really let go of this fear of rejection, and it's created this deep, profound level of freedom where I can openly talk about these things now. And if my parents hear it, read about it, and they say like, Joe, I can't believe you tell people publicly that story about when I cut your hair, it's like, that no longer affects me, because I know me sharing this stuff is having an impact on people who are hearing it, who are going through it. And if me sharing it and being vulnerable in that way has even impacts one person's life, it's worth it. And if my parents are still hanging on to that story of like, the fear of what that means about them, like I don't have any hostility towards them. I don't like, I'm forgiving them. I know that they are the way they are because of their own wounding, their own trauma, their own ability to go deep within themselves and look at their own inner world. And I had to let go of needing to save them really and help support them. And it's like, that level of freedom has been super profound. And it's so fascinating. We talk about freedom, and freedom's been one of my biggest journeys, is like, I just keep reaching and accessing like deeper and deeper layers of what that even means. And, circling back to even like the food piece and the sovereignty and the growing my own food. It's like, how deep does this journey go? It's like,
yeah, it seems like you need to be completely rejoined with God at some level if you're going to be truly free. But I mean, I think even a bigger theme that was coming up there almost at the end of it, right, is kind of this idea of, if your parents are listening or following along, and even the model of love, right? Like how do we model our love towards other people is a reflection of how we model love towards ourselves even. And I don't know, there's a piece of me that seems like, even if at some level they hear all of this esoteric stuff, and I think I heard in Kyle's podcast, your daddy even would talk about how meditation was like a chance for the devil to get inside you, which I'm huge on meditation, so we can get that in a second. But the core fundamental thing that feels like is coming up here is that this could be even an avenue for your parents to know you and experience you in a different light that's almost unfiltered. Because I have a similar relationship with my mom, where maybe not to the extreme of like all this, but she, at some level, there's probably some sort of barrier or thing that we're still working through in our life. But I know she listens to like all of my podcasts. So she has these like little times where she's listening, and then she has these ideas that come up. And so it seems to me that even this podcast is a way for me to expand the relationship with my mom, where she hears something, she's like, I don't really understand that, or that doesn't make sense to me, or are you sure you really want to be putting this out there? And so it even opens up that dialogue of like, okay, here's the way that my parents saw the world, and like now they can see how I'm experiencing the world. So like, as we even kind of started this, is like, okay, we slightly disagree about something here, like where's the line of truth that runs through it? Because this was even a quote that popped up in my head earlier, but when you were talking about truth, like there's a quote by Paramahansa Yogananda, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he has a quote that's like, truth is never afraid of questions. And so it's like, no matter how many questions you use, no matter what questions you find, like the truth is always going to be there at the bottom of the rabbit hole, of the pit, of the things. It's like, so, the only thing that we're afraid of is that ego identification, that worldly view that we're clinging to, the person, the thing, the item. But the quicker we can like let that go, the quicker we can find deeper truth, deeper meaning, even in our own lives.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I love that. Yeah, it's the questions that actually allow you to get to the deeper truths. And like without the questions, you're not actually going to be able to find the truth, which is
Right.
really powerful. And it's a really great point. I mean, the potentiality is there, right? And back to that fear of rejection, like if I'm ever going to have the potential of being fully accepted, approved, received, heard by my parents for who I am, then I got to be able to speak and share who I am and what I believe. And if they reject that, then that's fine. But if I'm putting on a mask or saying a story because I want their approval, I want their acceptance, then even if they get to a point where they're accepting me, they're not accepting me, they're accepting the mask of what I'm putting on to receive that validation and acceptance. So it's like the freedom is in and it creates the potential for there to be an experience, and I'm holding on to hope for that, right? It's like this, they may come to a point like we don't really understand it, but we love you and we accept you for like what you do share and what you do believe. And yeah, but to get to there, the only way that's even a potential is if I'm fully speaking from my heart and my truth. And until I get to that point, then it's always going to be like the rejection is always going to be manifest because I'm rejecting myself first.
Right. And then the world just has a way of amplifying that back to you. I'm also finding, I'm also kind of finding a funny visual where, we're talking about all this like fear and doubt and shame that you were going through. And yet I'm sure on the outside, I didn't look up your stats, but being a center, I'm sure you were at least like 6'4", 6'5", and, 280 pounds. And yet, this is like a physical representation, which I'm sure there were people who were even just afraid of your build. And yet underneath the surface is, for lack of a better word, like a scared child almost of trying to find acceptance, trying to find all this stuff. And it's almost like this comical, ironic, representation of everything that we're talking about.
Yeah, totally. I think it's interesting to know that, you know, everybody is going through some type of internal narrative and story and fear and wounding and experience. And I think it goes back to, being able to know who I am and be confident in myself. Like when I walk into a room, I don't have anything to prove to anyone. And I think naturally when, somebody walks in and they need to take up space or they need to share a lot or like whatever it is to like you can almost tell like their insecurities just kind of
Overcompensating.
radiating off of them because of they're trying to fill that void or that insecurity with the story and needing to be received or seen in a certain way. And that level of freedom, when you access that level of freedom, like it radiates, there's a frequency to it and it creates safety and even the environment energetically where you can connect with people and listen and hear and accept and receive people for who they are. And even if they are acting and insecure or they're a little bit more ego driven, it's like being able to be curious with them and hold space. I mean, that's really the path that I'm on, and the work that I do is really helping hold space and containers for people to feel seen, to feel heard. Because I think back to like the whole mental health crisis and where we're at as a society is, I think 99% of what could really help support mental health, emotional health, and all of the things that we face collectively is, people just desire to be seen and heard and accepted and felt. And if you can create a space for that, but in order to create the space fully, find that within yourself. And so back to like, if you want to change the world, the only way to change the world is by changing yourself. And if you can fully accept and heal and find that freedom within, you can start holding that space for others. And that's why I love kind of circling back to what we shared about Jesus. Like Jesus, like he was talks about in the Bible, like he hung out with, the kind of the quote unquote like kind of scum of the earth or the rejected ones, the people that weren't super accepted, and he was able to like be in a place of non-judgment. And because of that, he was able to heal people. And he didn't heal people because he had special powers. He healed people because he was healed and he was present, and he saw people, he saw their heart, he held them, he received them, he loved them. And in that process, it's like whoa, like if you felt that from somebody, it's like it's the most powerful thing in the world.
It'll change you. It's like that just divine frequency, right? Of what we're calling Christ consciousness, or I think in Hinduism they call it Krishna consciousness, which is just like well, they call it something else, but I know Krishna is like their version of Christ. But yeah, it's weird. It's like if you're just surrounded by that energetic vibration, and I think there's just plenty of studies that even reiterate this, right? Whereas if you're surrounded by fear, lack, scarcity, all of this darkness, like, I mean, what options do you have if you don't have a model for what's good, what's high vibration, or even, and in this case, the pathway towards self-realization or God or the embodiment of it? Then that's like, you need something or someone in order to be like, oh, okay, like that's the path that I'm looking for. So I need to figure out a way to kind of completely align with that. And it's crazy too, because it seems to me, especially as I've been on this path, that it changes the environment around you for the better. It's like you got to change your internal self, and it's almost like the reverse onion, right? Like I know a lot of people on the healing journey talk about like how many more layers of the onion are we going down, but it's like once you get to even close to the core, I guess it was just once you even start, it has this weird outward effect where everything else starts to even just vibrate differently, right? It's like either people change or they leave, and it's kind of this cool weird phenomenon that occurs where it's like, okay, like for instance, like we wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't heal, or even if you yourself didn't heal. Like we wouldn't be on the same vibration or frequency in order to sit down and have this conversation. And so it's really quite fascinating the way that once you kind of zoom out and take this like third person perspective of the way things are changing or evolving in your life, how you actually get to see all the nuanced differences that seem to be shaping or flowing or coming in or going out of your life. And even to take this maybe to like a metaphysical, and then I think there's probably a story in here you might have, because I know, again, I'm going back to that podcast where the society that we're living in, communication is just, it seems to be so disjointed and so broken, in the sense that it creates almost more of this incongruency, right? Almost more of this hardship. And even in your story, whenever I was listening to it, it seemed like even that miscommunication in the NFL, it like just radiates. Like it's permeated in almost all aspects, where it's like you had no idea if you were starting or playing, the next day. And so did you see at all how, let me think of how to articulate this. Did you see at all like if there were different environments where like communication could have been like, or maybe even the why, right? Like, do you feel like that the communication breakdowns that you were experiencing in the NFL were a symptom of like something bigger at large, and that there was a way that they could have even been altered or reconstructed so that more people were on the same page? Like, I'm kind of having a difficult time articulating a question here, but do you kind of feel where I'm going with this?
Yeah. Do you mind if I go to the restroom real quick before we
Yeah,
jump into that?
go ahead, do your thing. Can't have you distracted on what we're talking about here,
I
right?
was losing my thread.
It's all good. Yeah. So we're back. We got the thread back.
Yeah, I think you're talking about communication and the greater, reason why people struggle to communicate.
Yeah, because it seems like it was one of those threads that also would have chipped away at your love for the game of football. Because I know I have like a couple other friends who have played in the NFL, and I know one of them in particular like can't even be around like conversation about fantasy football, or just even the NFL as a whole. It's like if we're watching football, he's got to leave the room kind of deal. And it's really fascinating to me, because it seems like whether it seems like, especially in his life, like the lack of communication, not knowing, that scarcity, right? The feeling accepted. Like once you've always been the best at something your entire life, and and maybe even relied on it at some level for like validation, and then now everyone's kind of like being short with you. It might bring up some wounding from your past as well of not being accepted. So like, how does, I mean, communicate, how does specifically, I guess, does communication kind of play into that role? And do you see anywhere that it could be, or do you see any ways that it could be improved at like a mass scale?
Yeah. I mean, it's so complex and nuanced. And I think if we widen the lens out to kind of the collective, systemic, societal, cultural issue, it comes back to this lack of understanding of self and this projection of our ideas of who people are. And I think it comes back to like judgment, right? And I apologize with my camera. Dang.
It's all good. Just getting
Are you
slow.
are you doing video too?
I am, but definitely the more audience is on the audio, but we can see.
Let me see if you want to take a.
All right, so third time's a try. If Joe's face looks a little bit blurry, I'll find some good filters. Maybe we'll get the filter with like the glitter below the eyes or something.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it was really nice for a long time, but yeah, apologies for the technical difficulties. We're flowing, and it's really about the conversation more than anything.
It's all right. We'll find it again. If we found our way back
Yeah,
there once.
yeah. But I mean, I have the thread. I think the communication and it comes back to this lack of understanding of self, and we don't know how to communicate our inner world because we're so attached to this projection of our reality. And that's the interesting thing we talk about is like when you start changing yourself and you go inward, and it's like all these spiritual esoteric teachings. That's why they always talk about like as within so without. It's you start to clean the lens in which you view reality, everything changes. And so back to the idea of like, if you want to change the world, you got to change yourself, because the way I view you from my level of consciousness 5 years ago is different than how I view you now. And it's every single person that I know is just a projection of who I think they are, which is really fascinating to think about and to contemplate. Is that I'm creating a story always of every single person I interact with. I can never fully know the depth of who they are and what they've been through. And so when it gets back to like communication, like of course we don't know how to properly communicate. And when we have all this like judgment and resentment and these unconscious triggers and patterns and projections of reality of our own biases and our own experiences, and it's overlaid onto the world, like it's hard to know how to properly communicate. And with the NFL, and it's just one of these and with leadership in general, it was really challenging to be a part of that environment, because all I really like needed was somebody to come up to me and be like, hey, we noticed that you're really struggling, or your body language is off, or you're not performing like we need you to, and if you don't change or shift, or we're going to cut you. To have that conversation seems a lot more practical and smart as an investment into a player than just being like, hey, he's not up to snuff, let's just cut him. And I think it's individual. I think there's a bigger collective obviously issue, and I think some of the reasons I shared, but I had a coach. His name was Mike Tice, one of my favorite coaches I played for, and I was only able to play for him for 4 games because he was there for a year, and I blew my knee out 4 games into playing with him. But he was such a breath of fresh air, because when he came in, he played in the NFL for 15 years, so he understood. Like, he was a player's coach. He understood what we were going through, and it was so refreshing because he would come into our offensive line meeting room, and we'd have like a younger guy. There's started training camp. There's 15 to 18 offensive linemen, and we only hold 9 to 10 offensive linemen on the team. So everybody knows, 8 or 9 of us are going to get cut. And usually there's, the starters are pretty solid. It's like, who's going to start? And there's like, maybe 2 to 3 roster spots for like 10 people to like fight for. And he would come in oftentimes and be like, hey, let's say Jeff, I was just up in a meeting with the front office and some of the scouts and the general manager, and the topic of conversation was, you're not doing good enough. and you're not doing good enough in one-on-ones. And unless you change something and show up and play better, they're talking about cutting you. And I wanted you to know that to your face so that you could attempt to do something to
Right.
improve. And you know that this is where they're at. And because he said that, it created such a profound respect for this man that, like, I know that he's going to tell me how it is. Like if I'm on the chopping block, he's not gonna like tiptoe around and be like, oh, like we can't let Joe know because that might affect his performance. He's gonna come in and tell me to my face, like, hey, we're thinking about cutting you, and you need to do better. And that alone created such a profound respect for this coach that I wanted to do everything in my power to play as best as I could for this guy. And so I think that was obviously not the norm. That was an outlier, but because he was so deeply connected from personal experience on what he would want to be treated like, that's how he showed up. And it's fascinating in the NFL. There's like it's like a $25 billion a year industry, and it's fascinating how it's a really big business, and obviously the sports side of it, and some of the people that are in charge of making these really big business decisions worth millions of dollars, they they're not very good, they're not just they're not good business people. They maybe never played football, and it just blows my mind sometimes looking at like the people in the decision making roles, that how they found themselves there. But it's it's one of those things, like it's about who you know and like working your way up, and it's the culture of like looking out for yourself. It's a really fascinating experience to
Hmm.
be a part of the NFL and have to create like a team dynamic, and this is family and we're going to do it together, but then holding that, and then also holding like, I got to look out for myself. It's all about my own journey and my livelihood, and this is my
Right.
job and I need to compete, and like holding the tension of both of those is something that's really challenging, and it takes a special kind of psychological
Well,
development.
and it even seems like it might not be possible. Like and maybe the NFL is a fact that it is, but to me it seems like, having this articulation of like family, team, like an underpinning of that would be communication, right? I mean, there's a reason it's the number one amendment. It's the very first one that we put into the Constitution. It's the most. It has to be. I mean, it like just fundamentally, it feels like it's the most important thing of being human is to communicate, right? And then you want to take another layer onto that, and we're trying to build a team, a family, and we're trying to achieve a singular goal, right? Like we all want to work together to achieve a singular goal. You would think that the what would it be, like the foundation that should be built upon is upon trust and honesty, and even more so, like kind of even what you're saying, it's like if you want the best from people, you should tell them exactly how it is. Because I mean, there's a couple of stories that are coming to mind. I mean, even my situation, whenever I got out of us being a software engineer, I saw a lot of highlights of that where like I wasn't being directly told when I was coming up short. It was like I wasn't told for like 6 months after the fact, and of course, that was when pay raises came in, and it's like, well, you're not getting a raise because all of these things you failed upon, and it's like, why are you telling me this 6 months after the fact? I could have corrected all these by then, and I mean that's a whole nother story, but I think to your point, it's like if communication isn't there in an organization, at some point in time it has to start crumbling or eroding or becoming, less than what it is. And it's really fascinating to see such prolific um a prolific organization such as the NFL, right? The common thing is that they took back Sunday from the church, and it's like how could something so profound be plagued with such a baseline of foundational, tenet of being human and collectivity and family and teamwork and all of those ethos.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what we were talking about throughout the show, and is the fear, the wounding, the trauma, how it all shows up. Like back to my story with my fiance, like I wasn't able to communicate my feelings in my inner world because it would lead to conflict. It would lead to fear of rejection. It would lead to this fear of being seen and sharing how I actually feel. And And so it's a part of this wider conversation of why people aren't able to communicate, is because their idea of what their past experiences has led. If I tell you that you need to do something differently, like what's that going to turn into? So I'm just not going to share it. And it creates these expectations that aren't properly communicated, which creates the conflict, which creates the disconnection. And I think it really comes down to the conversation of of a different, like defining leadership in a different way and learning to lead in a different way. And I think in our kind of patriarchal, like hierarchical dynamic of leadership, we have a lot of immature, unhealed leaders that are in leadership positions, and they're projecting, because they're in a place of quote unquote power, they are projecting their own wounding out. And until they actually take responsibility and develop some of the tools that we're talking about here and lead with more compassion, more heart, more presence. But in order to do that, you have to go on a journey of understanding yourself and healing and responsibility. And so that's why I'm really passionate about what I do now, is supporting this new paradigm of leadership and shifting into more heart-centered leadership. And in order to lead from the heart, you have to lead yourself. And in order to do that, you have to go on this journey of healing and understanding of self and exploration of your inner world and what makes you tick, and excavating some of your unconscious patterns. And so it all leads to this spiritual maturity, and it's hard to separate. And that's why I love talking about spirituality from a very grounded place. And I know, like, language matters, and like when you get too esoteric, it's like, how does this apply? Well, it's like this journey of going inward is really like practical. And if you want to become a better leader, if you want to find more success, you want to find more presence, you want to find more fulfillment, more happiness, like it all leads back to this.
Yeah. So are there any like modalities or tools that you use on, whether it's like a day-to-day basis or week-by-week basis, to maybe cultivate a stronger sense of spirit or directionality, or increasing your own intuition throughout days or weeks?
Yeah, I think some of the tools and practices. I mean, it's like meditation, finding stillness, learning to listen to myself and my heart. And it's a process of constant unfolding and desire to understand oneself and how we tick. And journaling, finding time to contemplate and process and integrate. I think, and I just got off the river. I was on a multi-day rafting trip, and we can get into kind of what I do now with my business. But I think getting out in nature and finding stillness and doing some type of pattern interrupt. We get so in a world filled with so much distractions and so much content and so much to learn and so much to do, and we can get so bogged down in the routine of life that we're just kind of on this hamster wheel, like continuing to go, 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 go. And sometimes all you need is to interrupt that. And I think one of the most powerful things you can really implement is kind of it's like an intangible, like ethereal concept, but it's implementing spontaneity into your life. Because even on the physiological understanding of the brain and how neural pathways work, if we're in a constant routine in the same environment doing the same things over and over again, those neural pathways get wired and hardwired, and they get more and more calcified, and so it's harder and harder to change. And if you build more spontaneity into your life, like instead of driving the same way to work, as a simple example, driving the same way to work, like take a different route, go the long way, and just recognize how that's going to break some type of neural connection, create some neural pathway. That's why one of the things when I was walking away from the NFL, part of one of the variables that was involved in that decision was, halfway through my career is when all this lawsuit around CTE and brain trauma and how TBI and the effect that has on players in contact sports, and that created this real underlying fear of like, holy cow, I don't want to like have early onset dementia. And what is brain trauma is fucking scary. If I break my arm, I put a cast on it, like I can still function. But when it's my neurodegenerative disease, it's like affecting the very lens in which I view reality, my consciousness, my mood, like all of these things. that's fucking frightening. And as I started really confronting that fear in a very real way, it's like, okay, how can I be proactive with my brain health? I started learning about neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and this idea that you only have a certain number of brain cells, and if you lose them, you're fucked. It's like that. No, like you can regenerate brain cells, and I started learning about anti-inflammatory foods and nutrients that's good for the brain, and then understanding, okay, like learning new things and expanding my awareness creates new neural pathways, novel experiences. Like that's why travel is so important. Like going not just to like an all-inclusive resort, but like going on a backpacking trip or a road trip to go get into an unknown environment that you can't predict what's next creates this radical presence and breaking down and expansion of these new neural pathways. And then getting into some of the work with psychedelics and plant medicine and how the research around that creating new neural connections in the brain. And so that's kind of what got me on this path of really taking care of my brain health, has actually led me to deeper levels of awareness and expansion of my consciousness because of the neural pathways that I wanted to create so I could have better brain health, is like also expanding my awareness and expanding my understanding of self. And it's really cool how, if you really want to care for yourself and your health, like if you go down that path, it's actually going to lead to deeper levels of spirituality and connection and awareness too. It's like all connected.
It's so wild. And so did you find in this kind of journey, right, especially maybe with the brain and the mental and CTE stuff, like because I think even as someone who played football in high school, right, and has, relatively probably not nearly as much head you know head contact, head abuse maybe as yourself, what did you find whenever you were deep researching this? Like, what are some things that we are able to do to keep the brain functioning, keep it regenerating more efficiently? Is meditating solid? Are there certain foods? Are there certain minerals, vitamins?
Yeah, I would say, even like there's a lot of different things you can do. I think I read a book called Genius Foods, which I forget the author's name. I think it might be Max Lugervar or something. But his mom had early onset dementia and Alzheimer's, and so he went on this deep path of researching, like, how can I help prevent uh, neurodegenerative disease. And he did a lot of deep research on the actual foods that we eat. And one of the worst things for the brain is high inflammatory foods. And there's specific foods that are really good for brain health, like almonds, blueberries, avocados. And then there's stuff that's really terrible for not only the brain but for the body. And I think one of the things that most people don't talk about is the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty oils, that are literally in almost every single thing that we eat. And these oils are created because they have a high burn rate. So like they don't burn, so you can like put them in things and like processed foods and all this stuff, and they don't break down at high temperatures, and that's what the reason they use them. But if you think about on a very simplistic way, like if your body's, or if they're not breaking down at high temperatures, then how is your body able to really break them down in your digestion and stuff? And so they attach to and are unable to be processed within the body, which creates these high inflammatory states, which leads to joint pain, discomfort, and is really, really bad for brain health. And so if you're thinking about, how can I be proactive with my brain health, even if you don't experience like contact that much, I mean, it's really important because the brain obviously is the filter in which we view reality, like I shared earlier. And so if you want to expand your consciousness and connect deeper with, your emotions and your mental health and your spiritual health, it all starts in the physical body and what you're fueling your body and what food you're eating. And it's there's all these different fad diets that you can follow, but I think the biggest thing is, am I eating real food or am I eating poison? And if you're not checking the label of every single thing you eat, like start there. And if you don't really know what you're looking for, if I look at something, I always look at the label now. And if I look at something and it has more than like 5 ingredients, like at the ingredient levels, like it's just like a whole list, I just put it back down. Like automatically, I don't even need to read it.
It's bigger than the
And if
nutrition label.
yeah, look at the nutrition label. And a lot of people, there's like we're kind of programmed to look at macros, right? Like how many grams of protein, how many grams of carbs, how many grams of fat. I mean, that's really irrelevant if the ingredient list is like, because they can genetically engineer food to have different macros in it to look healthy.
For
But if
sure.
the ingredient level is like this, it's you're eating literally poison. Your body struggles to break that stuff down. And so eating more, I like to say, like eating more high vibrational food, like fruits, vegetables, things from nature. Like start there and just notice how much better you feel, because inflammation affects everything, our mood, our health, everything.
Yeah, I know. I think I saw, and it's a huge, and it should not be an understated point, which is to read the ingredients. Like that's so powerful. And I even know there's like these tortilla shells, which you look at the back of them, it's, you know, just a whole bunch of random stuff, but they had one, like one variation of their brand, which was like spinach herb was like the brand. And so the shell was like a little bit green. And so it's like sitting there, you're like, oh, okay, there's spinach in here. And then whenever you go and read the ingredients, it's like the very last or one of the last things on the thing. Then it's like, oh, there's like spinach, like coloring or something. It's like not even, they didn't even put real spinach in it. They just like took the coloring out of it or something. Dude, I don't even know. When I saw that, I was like, this is fucked up. Like they're
Yeah.
putting on the label spinach herb, and yet I don't even think there's actually spinach in it.
Yeah, there was something that happened. I forget the exact point in time that this happened, but it was like before like the 2000s, maybe in like the 80s or 90s, when there was like a law passed where before this law you used to have to say, like I think with crab, for example, like if it's natural crab or imitation crab, you had to like say that it was imitation crab if it wasn't actual real, and you had to like market it that way. And there was something that shifted where they no longer on the marketing label had to actually tell you what it is. They just had to say it on the ingredients. And so like to your point, there's all this stuff like on the front that looks like the branding and marketing is really good and it looks super healthy, and they can market like this is a health food, and then you look at the
Oh,
ingredients and it's like all this bullshit in it. So you got to be very, very careful nowadays. It's really
well,
fascinating.
and especially I know there's my dad was just recovering from a knee surgery, and so he needed to get like protein shakes or something. And there was one protein shake that he bought, and it was like, it even said on the label, like doctors recommend and high protein and, you know, low carbs. But then you look at the very first ingredient was water. And then the second one was high fructose corn syrup. And I'm sitting there like, dude, there's no chance, first of all, that any common sense doctor is recommending this. Like, did they like just pay to give someone a doctorate degree and then just like say that they like, dude, it to me, I was just like, this is insane.
That's the hard thing about the system that we live in, is the doctors are educated for 8 to 12 years in this education system where, you know, I think there's like one class that's mandatory that's on nutrition in their whole time that they're in school. And that nutrition is from the lens of a paradigm that says this is what health food is. And even with doctors, like how disconnected are they from the actual first thing you should look at when you're unhealthy is what are you fueling your body with? And high fructose corn syrup is like, it's fake sugar that literally your body will just turn straight into fat, and like just so unhealthy, like your body doesn't know how to process it. That's the first ingredient. Then it's like the fact that a doctor's recommending that just tells you how fucked up our entire paradigm is of health. And I mean, we've created a business that is in their best interest for the bottom line to keep our population sick. And when you start looking at that stuff, like back to my kind of point earlier when I'm like connecting this deeper level of freedom and like this disconnection from our food source and where our food's coming from, even the fruits and vegetables don't have the nutrient density that they once had even 50, 100 years ago.
Dude, yeah.
And so we're not eating food that is actually good for us. We're eating poison. And once you start doing that, like you don't even talk about trying to expand your awareness and consciousness if you're not even checking on what you eat. And you know, I heard this actually very recently. It was one of my friends, one of his spiritual teachers said, you know, because there's all this talk about like spirituality and calling in abundance and freedom, and when it's done from this level of awareness that is in this old paradigm, it's like all another ruse to keep us trapped in the system. And if your spirituality isn't connecting you with your food and with the earth and with reciprocity, then you got to really question like what am I actually doing here? What am I connecting with? It's
Mm,
like you're still it's another way to trap you in this game, in this machine. And I'm just now, I've been on this path for a long time. I'm just now starting to realize like, okay, like real spirituality is connecting with nature and connecting with where my food comes from. Like that's the real grounded connection to nature, and how we get back to this story of what Charles Eisenstein is evolving and reconnecting with this story of interbeing and not separation.
yeah, dude. Yeah, it's crazy too because I know I've even seen where I don't quote me. Well, maybe I shouldn't say it if I'm going to say don't quote me on this, but I know that they're even kind of like pumping the soil with like artificial stuff such that foods are getting bigger. And maybe I should fact check myself before I say something like that. Here's what I will say that I know is true. I'm not sure how much you've traveled out of the country, but whenever it comes to things like bread, for instance, like here, if you eat bread, you could eat like an entire loaf and not feel full at all. But if you go over to like Italy or even Israel or like Egypt and you just have like one slice of bread, dude, it's so satiating that it's crazy. Like it's just you can just feel it tastes so much more real in a sense, which is weird because I always kind of like made this mental association of like wheat, grains, inflammation, it's not good for you. But I think big picture, it's like one of those moderation things. Big picture, if you're getting all the real nutrients that are probably supplied with it, it's a lot more healthy. And not even that, but you're not like stuffing yourself full of 20 pieces that all the nutrients is packed into maybe half of one.
Yeah, totally. And everything, that's why it's so important to check the labels. Like there could be, three of a similar product or a similar type of food on the shelf. And if you don't look at the ingredients, one of them could be first ingredient high fructose corn syrup, and the other one's actual whatever it is, like cane sugar. It's like this that alone is like go to the one that has the cane sugar. And when you start looking at labels, you'll
Right.
start recognizing there's little changes you can make. And usually those healthier products are a little bit more expensive, maybe like 50 cents, $1 more. But there's a reason for that, because they put all these shitty ingredients in, because at scale it's cheaper for them. If it's like a penny or two cheaper per item of product, they're going to make that decision, because at scale, selling millions of items, like it's going to lead to millions of dollars in their pocket. And so when you start looking at how the whole system collectively works, you really start, it's back to the radical responsibility. Like you need to start really taking responsibility for what you're putting in your body and start there. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a big piece of it too, where when you talk about all this stuff, you look at how bad the systems are, how messed up they are. It kind of the best thing you can do is like bring it back into yourself. Like, okay, we're talking about how all of this, food is bad, malnutrition, over farming. They're putting stuff in the certain foods and telling us to eat certain things. And I think what we're kind of hinting at here, which is to take that ability like within yourself, make sure you know where the source is, go to your local farmers markets, go to start your own farm if you have the ability. And I think that's probably the way, because it starts at the individual, right? Like if you didn't do it, then you wouldn't be able to come on the podcast and tell us about it, right? And so I think it's probably that's the way you combat this, is like, don't try to fight the system, right? Try to change yourself. Try to look at what you have in your general vicinity and be like, okay, I choose to no longer go to the supermarket. I choose to go to farmers markets. I choose to grow my own. And I think over time, that's kind of how you chip away at these behemoths, right? It's the David and Goliath story, if you will, where it's like, this is how you can embody that David that's kind of within all of us.
Yeah, and I think if this is sparking a curiosity to any of your listeners, I think like Kyle Kingsbury, if you go listen to his podcast, like this is really the topic of most of his conversations is around food sovereignty and moving more towards this localized um, individual connection to your food. And he just had someone on his podcast, I think it was episode 300, the one after, or the one I was on, and they talked about this. And it's really fascinating because they talked about even this whole idea of regeneration and regenerative farming is still getting lost in the mass consumerism and the mass like corporate story at scale that we're, it's like, it's a really fascinating conversation, because even when you think you're like, okay, I'm gonna buy this regenerative made grass-fed beef, if it's still coming from the supermarket and the system, it's still a part of the very system that we're trying to wake up out of, and it can be very overwhelming and daunting. And people are like, well, where do I start? I don't have land, I can't grow my own food, I can't survive. It's like he talks about in that episode, I forget who he had on, but it was really, really good. And it's like, if you don't know where to start, then look down and start where your feet are. And what he means by that is go to your local farmer and say, how can I help, how can I support, do you have food that I can buy from you? And it really comes down to this conversation of like really buying local, and just from the simple fact of how do we navigate this great shift that we're moving through, and the potentialities of total chaos and anarchy with, if the systems we live in are very fragile at scale. And as we saw during COVID, it's like, supply chain and like food, like if we're unable to get food into supermarkets, like what happens to people after a few days of not being able to eat? Like it gets really scary really quick. And so if you just start developing those relationships with local farmers, and they're everywhere, and you just got to do a little research and start putting that groundwork. And it is overwhelming, and I'm not saying it's something like I need to be better at, and I'm just starting down this path. And I think it's really cool. Like a lot of people I know, it's almost as if there's this collective download that's happening, that's like this whisper from spirit that's like, hey, it's time to get back to who we are. It's time to remember, it's time to reconnect with our food, reconnect with nature. And I truly believe that there's so many of us coming online and answering this call back to more localized regenerative ways of farming and growing our own food, that there's plenty of potential to get involved. And you're not alone if you're starting to get curious about this. It's just about educating yourself, one, and then connecting with people that are on this path. And I think Kyle's podcast is a really, really great place to start. And some of his podcasts are really overwhelming, even for me. I'm like, oh cow, like I feel like there's so much work to be done. But you just got to start today, now. And I think it starts with something as simple as checking your labels and taking responsibility for what you're putting in your body.
I think that's probably a metaphysic or a general thing that's probably going on. Even with like spirituality, it's like, oh, there's so much more work. Oh, there's so much more wounding. But it's like, at some point you just got to start, right? Just one step at a time. Where are you at right now? What's the first layer? And also on top of that, I want to make a disclaimer that this is not sponsored in any way by Kyle's podcast. Even though this is probably the most we've ever talked about a podcast on this podcast. But yeah, man, it's just, it's so wild. It's weird because it seems like it's almost like we might make it more complex than it needs to be. Like it seems like if we've given so much into the system, it seems like it can take so much to get out of it. But at the same time, it seems like just one step at a time. If you just make that one step to uncover this new thing about yourself, this one step to just stop eating your fruits from the market, instead go to a farmer's market for your mushrooms and fresh veggies, get the rest of the supermarket. You just make these little pivots, and it kind of, you find your way out of it. And I think there's probably a parallel here with even you kind of standing up for yourself, in the big picture, with like standing up for yourself, like saying, no, I'm like the leader. Do you really want to rely on this guy? And I bet at some level, like that small step, leads to you to where your story kind of went, where you found yourself like kind of approaching free agency, saying like, okay, this is my dollar amount, or else I'm walking because I need to protect myself, because you're standing up for your physical health, your bodily health. And it seems like that even started to exacerbate the whole situation that we really dove into here. And so where I'm curious, right, is because we talked about you going up to the top of that mountain, and then afterward it's like, okay, what the hell am I doing next? Like, what's the world like after football? So you've brought up a couple times, you have a business, you have this farm you're doing. Is this the new mountain that you're trying to climb or trying to build that you're going to use for, whatever it is that this spirit is whispering to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think naturally I would like to start with I'm doing it from a different place, obviously. The mountain I was climbing, I didn't know it at the time, but uncovering, like I talked about earlier, why was I doing it? And there was these unconscious drivers to feel accepted, to feel approved of, to find success, to be happy. And I'm grateful that I got to that point at such a young age and was called to let it all go, because it led me on this path of deeper self-discovery. And naturally when you start waking up and going on this journey inward and desiring to understand yourself and heal, I think every single one of us that goes on this path develop a natural desire to be of service to something greater than the self and to others and those that we love. And so I'm doing it from this place of really wanting to be of service and getting back to and remembering what it means to be human and to not get too lost in this story of consumerism and materialism and all of this. And so the few projects I'm working on, in that I have the property 90 minutes outside Austin. It's called Haven. We're moving out there in a couple months once our remodel's done, and we're going to be doing a regenerative farm and starting a community village and opening a retreat center out there. And so I'm really passionate about facilitating transformational experiences and holding space for people to uncover and explore and to heal. And that's what I've been, training in through my own experiential process, but then also understanding and working with some mentors and doing some breath work and some different experiential processes to really help facilitate this deeper healing. So if anybody desires to go on that path or go through a retreat type experience, that's something that's going to be coming online over the coming months and years. So definitely check that out. And then my project that I'm in the process of launching right now is called the Härt Collective. And the Härt Collective is, I'm really focused on building community, because I truly believe that healing can really only take place in the presence of others and within community. And so the Härt Collective, I just launched and opened applications a few weeks ago. I don't know when this podcast is going to go live, but I'm bringing together 40 founding members to build the nucleus and foundation for this community of high impact leaders, entrepreneurs, visionaries, people that are really passionate about and desire, like some of this conversation we had, who have the ability and the resources and the impact to facilitate real change in the world. And so building community for them. And what I've found is you can't build community just because you want to. You got to go through some type of experiential process. And so I referred to the multi-river trip I just got off of, and I've been facilitating these deep wilderness expedition retreats the last couple of years. And there's just something really profound about being deeply immersed in nature that allows you to shed the layers of who you think you need to be, and then really initiating the energy of your heart that tends to bring people together. And so I have 2 permits this summer, one in June and one in August, and we're using those experiences to really facilitate the deep bonds and connections and that are required to build community. And then there's some really exciting things I have for the future of how to leverage the power of this collective network and community into greater initiatives in the world, so that we can actually have a greater impact. So it's not just about, there's a lot of spiritual communities, and then there's a lot of entrepreneurial communities out there, kind of merging the two. And it's not just about the individual transformational experience that will take place, but it's how do we have that experience to facilitate deeper bonds as a community, and then how do we leverage the power of community for greater initiatives and to be of service as a community to greater good. So that's really exciting. You can check that out at the HärtCollective.com. It's HART. And then I have my podcast too, called Life Beyond the Game, and I just relaunched that. And I bring on former elite athletes to talk about the transition process specifically, and talk more about these psychological processes and the healing, and how that journey, like I've referred to so many times throughout the show, propelled me on a deeper journey of self-discovery and healing. And I think there's something really cool about bringing on kind of these role models and these mentors and these people we look up to in our world as athletes, and getting to the depth of their story and how the letting go of this identity propelled them on a journey of deeper healing and self-discovery. And the intention there is to hopefully inspire others to feel not so alone in this process, because it's something that we're all moving through, no matter where you're at in life. We're moving through a massive paradigm shift collectively, and it can be disorienting at times. And to know that you're not alone and to find inspiration in other people's stories is really what I'm here to help facilitate.
Yeah, and dude, I mean, a ton of inspiration could definitely come from your story. Even just what you shared here was got me at one point super moving and powerful, man. So I'm super grateful for your time, bro. I think this feels like a good spot to wrap it up. I usually leave a last little segment for people to plug their stuff, but it seems like you've done that. But with that being said, I do want to give you this space just if you have like a last final message to just like, if you want to anchor into people, guys, you're going to be able to check out his links below. So if there's something you want to reference that you've already referenced, I know we'll link that below. But yeah, I want to give the floor to you if you have like a final message for the audience.
Thanks, brother. I really am deeply grateful for the opportunity and for the presence and the curiosity. I've obviously done a few podcasts, but you really enjoyed this one, and your ability to guide me into excuse me, I sneeze. Deeper layers of myself, and holding the space for the vulnerability, I think is just going to be really impactful to the audience. And so just thank you for what you're doing, and for you answering the call and the courage it takes to let go of things that got you to where you're at, and then being able to pave a new way and a new path. Just really honor it. And I'm also writing a book right now too, so I think that's going to be kind of taking all the stories I shared on Kyle's podcast and your podcast and the depth of it, and putting it into a book, which is going to be really, really fun. And last words of wisdom, I would say what's coming to me is something that I adopted. I read it in a book somewhere it was like before I walked away from the NFL, and it was kind of this mantra that I really I continued to really anchor into this guiding post of how I live my life. And it's, on the other side of fear lies freedom. And if freedom is what you're after and what you desire, then really understanding your fears and going into fear and developing a relationship with your fear. Fear is a guiding post. It's a guiding light. It's, if something triggers a fear response within you, then it's probably something you should explore. And for me, like, walking away from football is like the scariest thing ever, because like I was literally walking into the unknown, and to do that, it takes courage. And if you really, I've contemplated this quite a bit. If you look at fear and courage, and if you look at them as frequencies, they're really the same frequency, just differences in degree. And the reason I know that is because without fear, there would be no opportunity to be courageous. And it, getting a little more esoteric and in alignment with this show, is I tend to believe that the universe or God, really one of the reasons we're here, because that's one of the big questions, right? Like, why are we here? What's the purpose of all this? And I think it comes down to experience. We're here to experience. And one of those experiences that I believe God or the universe or consciousness or source, whatever you want to label it as, one of the experiences that we're here in this realm of existence, in this reality, in this dimension, is to have an opportunity to experience courage. And if we wouldn't have that opportunity if fear didn't exist. And so it's redefining your relationship with fear, understanding how fear shows up in your body, where these fears come from. And in the face of those fears, can you connect with the deep reservoir of courage it takes to answer the call of where your heart is leading you?
It's powerful words, man. It's powerful words. And whenever you get that book done, we'll have to do round 2. We'll find a way. At that point, we were talking before the show about how we're trying to get to transition to in-person interview. So whenever that book comes out, I know we'll find a way, whether it's in Austin or in Pittsburgh, we'll find a way to make a round 2 in person. So that'd be dope.
Oh yeah, dude, I'm looking forward to it. That'll give me some inspiration to get it over the finish line. I've been working on it for years. Anybody that's written a book, it's a daunting task, and hopefully I get it done in the next few months, and we can plan something when it gets released, maybe in the next year or so.
That'd be cool, man. I mean, hey, at the end of the day, you can't rush perfection. It's all going to happen in divine timing, right?
That's it. Oh,
cool. Well, with all of that being said, dude, Joe, thank you so much for being here, man. Incredible conversation. I really appreciate it. I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully the audience member has learned a lot as well. Guys, please, as always, share this podcast, because it's a win. Well, let me see if I get this right. Win situation. Joe wins because his message gets out there. My podcast gets out there. Your friend thinks you're super cool because you shared a dope podcast, and then your friend wins because they are now turned on to a super dope podcast. So if you're still in here, you're still sticking around, easy, zero cost way, everybody wins. And that's another way we can just spread some more abundance in the world. So with that being said, I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. And I will see you all in the 6th dimension.